Night settled slowly across medieval Europe, not with the bright electric glow familiar to the modern world, but with candlelight trembling softly behind narrow windows of stone and wood. In the villages scattered across the valleys of France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, the final sounds of evening drifted gently into silence. Horses exhaled pale clouds into the cold air. Wooden doors closed against the night. Somewhere in the darkness, a church bell echoed across sleeping rooftops, low and steady beneath the stars. Along narrow streets lined with uneven stones, merchants gathered the last of their fabrics and spices before covering them against the damp evening fog. Bakers carried the fading warmth of ovens into quiet homes where families shared dark bread, onion stew, and watered wine beside flickering fire. In monasteries hidden beyond forests and hills, monks bent silently over manuscripts beneath pools of golden candlelight, their ink scratching softly against parchment while winter winds moved through distant trees outside thick stone walls. The world felt permanent then. Kingdoms rose slowly. Seasons passed like turning pages. Most people never traveled farther than the next market town. Life unfolded through rhythms repeated across generations: planting in spring, harvest in autumn, prayer at dawn, rest at sunset. Beneath towering cathedrals and beneath fragile wooden cottages alike, people believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday. Even suffering carried familiarity. Hunger came and faded. Wars appeared far away. Illness visited homes from time to time, yet life continued onward with patient certainty. In the harbors of Venice and Genoa, ships rested quietly against darkened docks while sailors slept beneath heavy wool blankets. Crates of silk, salt, and spices waited beside the water, carrying the distant sense of unfamiliar world. Traders spoke softly of deserts beyond the Mediterranean, of crowded eastern markets glowing beneath lanterns, of caravans moving slowly across endless roads beneath pale moon. Their stories drifted through taverns like fragments from another universe, distant enough to feel almost dreamlike. And across Europe itself, beneath clouds moving silently above castles, monasteries, and sleeping farms, countless ordinary lives continued untouched by the future approaching them. Children slept beside fireplaces while mothers whispered evening prayers. Elderly men warmed stiff hands near embers fading into ash. Candle flames trembled gently in narrow rooms filled with wool blankets, wooden bowls, and the quiet comfort of routine. Yet beyond the horizon, beyond the familiar bells and stone walls of Europe, something unseen had already begun moving westward through the darkness, patient as winter itself. Far beyond the calm monasteries and crowded marketplaces, distant ports already carried rumors that few Europeans truly understood. Sailors arriving from eastern waters spoke quietly about strange sicknesses appearing in cities beyond the Black Sea, where entire households sometimes vanished within days. Most listeners dismissed such stories as travelers' exaggerations, the kind born from exhausting journeys and unfamiliar lands. Still, on certain cold evenings when the church bells faded and the streets emptied, those distant whispers lingered uneasily in the minds of merchants and monks. Beyond the familiar villages of Europe, the great trade roads of the medieval world stretched across continents like dark threads sewn through mountains, deserts, and distant seas. Long before dawn touched the rooftops of Paris or Florence, caravans already moved beneath cold eastern stars, carrying silk, spices, incense, and stories from lands most Europeans would never see. Camels crossed silent deserts where the wind erased footprints before sunrise. Merchant ships drifted across black waters beneath heavy clouds while sailors listened to waves striking wooden hulls in endless repetition. Inside crowded ports along the eastern Mediterranean, conversations had slowly begun to change. Traders who once spoke only of profits and weather now exchanged quieter observations in candlelit taverns. Some described strange fevers spreading through distant settlements beyond the Black Sea. Others mentioned entire streets falling silent after sudden illness passed through without warning. A few claimed they had seen ships arriving with crews already dying before anchors touched the harbor. Most listeners treated these stories carefully but without panic. The medieval world was already filled with uncertainty. Roads were dangerous. Famines appeared without warning. Illness belonged naturally to life itself. Few people imagined that scattered rumors from distant territories could ever reshape the foundations of Europe. And so the marketplaces remained busy. Bells continued ringing above crowded cities. Farmers still prepared fields beneath gray autumn skies while monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, unaware that invisible danger traveled steadily beside the commerce connecting civilizations together. At night, however, uncertainty often grows larger inside the human imagination. In narrow taverns warmed by firelight and wine, sailors sometimes lowered their voices while speaking of eastern ports where sickness seemed to follow arriving ships like a shadow. They described homes abandoned too quickly. They spoke of bodies buried outside city walls. Some whispered about punishment from God, while others blamed poisoned air drifting across the world from distant earthquakes or strange movements in the heavens. No one truly understood what they were describing. Far away from royal courts and cathedral towers, ordinary travelers carried unseen passengers across mountains and seas without realizing it. Rats slept quietly among grain sacks below wooden decks. Fleas hid within blankets and cargo crates while ships crossed dark waters towards Sicily, Venice, Marseille, and Constantinople. The movement felt ordinary then, almost peaceful, part of the endless rhythm of medieval trade that connected distant worlds together beneath moonlit skies, and still Europe slept. In villages surrounded by forests and frozen fields, mothers tucked children beneath wool blankets while winter rain touched the rooftops softly through the night. Priests prepared morning sermons beside fading candles. Bakers rested before another dawn beside warm ovens. Across the continent, life continued with comforting familiarity, even as something ancient and terrible moved patiently westward through the darkness, carried silently beside the commerce that had once made the medieval world feel vast, prosperous, and beautifully connected. The year did not announce itself with thunder or fire. No king stood before Europe to warn that history was about to divide itself into before and after. Instead, the change arrived quietly, almost invisibly, beneath gray skies and beside familiar routines. Winter drifted across the continent as it always had. Church bells continued echoing above sleeping towns. Candles flickered in monastery windows while snow gathered softly along stone roads disappearing into forests and distant hills. And yet, in certain harbors near the Mediterranean, something had begun to feel wrong. Ships arrived carrying more silence than conversation. Sailors stumbled weakly onto docks with pale faces and shaking hands. Some never woke from sleep below the decks where they had spent the night listening to waves strike the wood beneath them. Others burned with fever while dark swellings appeared beneath their arms and along their neck. The illness moved strangely, quickly, almost intelligently, leaving families frightened not only by death itself but by the speed at which ordinary life seemed capable of collapsing. For many medieval people, the world was shaped by faith, mystery, and symbols hidden within nature. Without modern medicine or scientific understanding, disaster often appeared inseparable from divine meaning. A comet crossing the sky could feel like a warning. Failed harvests carried spiritual weight. Disease itself seemed to belong not merely to the body, but to the invisible relationship between humanity, heaven, and the unknown forces governing existence. And so rumors spread through Europe wrapped in uncertainty and imagination. Some believed poisoned air drifted from the east. Others whispered that God was expressing anger toward a sinful world grown prideful beneath its cathedrals and kingdoms. In crowded taverns and candlelit churches, people searched desperately for explanations large enough to contain their fear. Yet even then, most could not grasp the scale of what was approaching. In quiet villages, children still chased each other through muddy roads while smoke curled gently from cottage chimneys into the cold evening sky. Merchants argued over wool prices in crowded marketplaces. Monks continued preserving ancient texts beneath flickering candlelight, unaware that many of the names they carefully copied belonged to a world already beginning to disappear around them. Across Europe, tiny signs accumulated like distant cracks beneath ice. Entire households became sick within days. Certain roads grew strangely empty. Travelers avoided unfamiliar towns after hearing stories carried from port cities along the coast. Priests began offering more funeral prayers than baptisms in some regions, though few yet understood the pattern forming across the continent. At night, beneath cathedral towers and winter stars, fear settled quietly into the spaces between ordinary conversations. People listened differently now when bells rang unexpectedly after midnight. They watched strangers more carefully in crowded streets. And somewhere beyond the horizon, moving steadily through ships, roads, marketplaces, and unseen corners of human life itself, the plague continued its silent journey into the heart of Europe, toward a civilization still sleeping beside the edge of catastrophe. Messina slept beneath a sky of drifting clouds and pale moonlight when the ships first appeared beyond the harbor. Long before sunrise touched the stone buildings of Sicily, fishermen standing near the docks noticed dark shapes emerging slowly from the sea, their sails hanging weakly in the cold Mediterranean air. The water moved quietly around them, no songs drifted from the decks, no sailors shouted instructions into the wind. Even from a distance, something about the arriving vessels felt deeply unnatural. The harbor itself remained calm at first. Merchants prepared for another ordinary morning while church bells echoed softly across the sleeping city. Bakers lit ovens before dawn. Lanterns trembled beside narrow streets still wet from nighttime rain. Messina had welcomed ships from distant ports for generations. Vessels arrived constantly carrying silk, grain, spices, and stories from the wider world beyond Europe's shores. The sea was not a warning to the people of Sicily, it was life itself. Yet as the strange ships drifted closer to the docks, silence followed them like a shadow. The sailors standing upon the decks moved slowly if they moved at all. Some collapsed against wooden railings beneath torn sails darkened by salt and weather. Others appeared feverish and confused, their faces pale beneath tangled hair and exhausted eyes. A few seemed already dead where they lay unmoving beside coils of rope and abandoned cargo. Witnesses later described the sight with lingering disbelief, as though the ships themselves had sailed directly out of some terrible dream. When harbor workers finally boarded the vessels, the true horror revealed itself gradually beneath the weak morning light. Bodies rested inside cramped sleeping quarters where entire crews appeared overcome without warning. The air smelled of sickness, saltwater, sweat, and decay. Some sailors still breathed faintly while burning with fever so intense they could barely speak. Dark swellings marked their necks, armpits, and groins, painful knots beneath the skin unlike anything most people in Messina had ever seen before. Many victims seemed trapped somewhere between sleep and delirium, whispering incoherently while trembling beneath blankets damp with sweat. Fear spread quietly through the harbor before panic ever arrived. At first, people searched for familiar explanations. Perhaps the sailors carried some ordinary sickness worsened by exhaustion at sea. Perhaps foul air from distant lands poisoned the crew during the journey westward. Medieval life already contained hardship everywhere. Illness belonged naturally to existence, but something about these ships resisted ordinary understanding. Healthy men appeared to weaken within hours after helping unload cargo. Dockworkers developed sudden fevers. Families living near the harbor began falling ill almost immediately after contact with the arriving sailors. And still, the bells continued ringing across Messina. Markets opened that morning as usual beneath gray skies drifting over the city walls. Merchants argued over prices while fishermen repaired nets beside the water. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythms of daily life, unease moved quietly through the streets. People avoided the harbor after hearing whispers from sailors and laborers who had witnessed the condition of the ships firsthand. Mothers pulled children closer while passing strangers. Priests offered prayers for the sick without realizing how many prayers would soon follow. The ships remained anchored beside the docks like silent warnings no one fully understood. Some authorities attempted to force the vessels back out to sea, terrified by what seemed to follow them ashore. But by then, the invisible damage had already begun. Rats moved freely between ship and harbor beneath cover of darkness. Fleas traveled unnoticed inside blankets, grain sacks, clothing, and wooden cargo crates unloaded onto Sicilian streets. The plague had entered Europe quietly, carried not by invading armies or collapsing kingdoms, but by ordinary trade routes that had once connected the medieval world together through commerce and curiosity. And as night settled once more across Messina, candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows while the city unknowingly stood at the edge of one of history's greatest catastrophes. By the time the ships reached Messina, many of the sailors aboard were already drifting somewhere between sleep and death. For weeks they had crossed dark waters beneath cold winds and restless skies, carrying cargo from distant trading ports along the Black Sea. At first the illness had seemed small enough to ignore. A fever here, a cough there. One exhausted sailor too weak to climb the rigging after days without proper rest. Life at sea was already harsh, and sickness often traveled beside long voyages like an unwanted companion. But this illness behaved differently. The first men to fall sick burned with fever so fierce that even cold night air brought them no relief. Their skin grew hot beneath trembling hands while exhaustion settled into their bodies with unnatural speed. Some complained of pain deep within their joints and backs, a heavy ache that made standing difficult. Others became strangely confused, staring silently toward the horizon as though listening to distant sounds no one else could hear. Then came the swelling. Painful dark lumps appeared beneath the arms and along the neck, hard against the skin like hidden stones pressing outward from inside the body itself. Sailors whispered fearfully about the marks spreading among the crew. No remedy seemed to help. Vinegar, herbs, prayers, smoke from burning incense, nothing slowed the illness once it took hold. Men who seemed healthy in the evening sometimes collapsed before morning, and many simply never woke again. Below the decks, inside cramped sleeping quarters lit only by weak lanterns, death arrived quietly during the night. The sound of waves striking wood continued endlessly around the ships while sick sailors drifted into restless sleep beside creaking beams and damp blankets. Some whispered prayers before closing their eyes. Others spoke deliriously about home, about wives waiting beside distant harbors, about fields and villages they hoped to see again after the voyage ended. By dawn, many lay still beneath the dim light filtering through narrow cracks in the hull. For the surviving crew, fear slowly became as heavy as the illness itself. Sailors who had crossed storms and wars now avoided touching one another whenever possible. Meals were eaten in silence. Men watched each cough with growing terror. Some believed poisoned air drifted from eastern lands. Others feared God had cursed the voyage for reasons no human could understand. Medieval people lived inside a world shaped by faith and mystery, where disease often felt inseparable from divine judgment or unseen spiritual forces moving through creation itself. No one aboard understood that something far smaller than any curse traveled with them. Beneath the decks, rats moved quietly among grain sacks and cargo crates while fleas fed unnoticed in darkness and straw bedding. The ships carried silk, spices, timber, and death together across the sea, all hidden within the ordinary machinery of medieval trade. The invisible nature of the sickness made it feel even more terrifying. There were no armies to fight, no walls strong enough to stop it. The danger moved silently from body to body, unnoticed until fever finally appeared. When the ships reached Sicily, the exhausted survivors stepped ashore carrying confusion as much as disease. Their faces looked hollow from sleepless nights and endless fear. Some could barely walk across the harbor. Others begged desperately for water, shelter, or prayer. Around them, the people of Messina stared uneasily at these broken travelers who seemed less like returning merchants and more like ghosts emerging slowly from the sea itself. And in many ways, they were the first shadows of a dying world already drifting toward Europe. Cold nights settled heavily over the port cities after the ships arrived, and beneath the wooden floors of crowded homes and warehouses, life continued moving in darkness unseen by human eyes. Rats slipped silently between barrels of grain, climbed through narrow walls, and nested beside warm bundles of cloth unloaded from distant harbors. For centuries, they had traveled harmlessly alongside merchants and sailors across the medieval world. Few people feared them. They belonged naturally to ports, ships, markets, and crowded streets where food and shelter could always be found. Yet hidden among their fur and within the shadows of cargo holds, something invisible now moved quietly through Europe. The people of Messina could not see the tiny fleas feeding upon the rats beneath the docks. They could not understand how sickness passed silently from ship to harbor, from warehouse to home, from stranger to family. Medieval knowledge explained disease through poisoned air, imbalance within the body, divine punishment, or mysterious changes in nature itself. The true pathways of infection remained buried far beyond the understanding of the age, and because the danger remained unseen, it spread with terrifying ease. Inside dark storage rooms near the harbor, workers continued carrying sacks of grain onto wagons bound for inland towns. Merchants still counted spices and fabrics beneath candlelight while rats moved quietly between the crates during the night. The ordinary machinery of trade never stopped. Ships unloaded cargo. Horses carried supplies along muddy roads. Inns welcomed travelers seeking warmth from winter winds. Every movement of medieval life unknowingly carried the plague farther into the continent. At first, the illness still felt distant enough for many people to deny its scale. Families whispered about fever spreading through certain neighborhoods, but Europe had known sickness before. Hardship was woven deeply into medieval existence. Harvests failed, winters killed the weak, disease visited cities from time to time and then disappeared again. Most people could not imagine that these scattered deaths belonged to something far larger already unfolding around them. Yet fear grows quickly when explanations fail. In Messina, entire households sometimes became ill within days. Neighbors watched healthy wealthy men weakened suddenly behind shuttered windows. Priests walked narrow streets carrying prayers to homes already filled with silence. Some citizens burned incense, believing scented smoke might cleanse the air. Others avoided strangers entirely, crossing streets to escape even brief contact with unfamiliar faces. Still, the rats remained beneath the floors. They moved through bakeries, monasteries, taverns, and crowded sleeping quarters untouched by human fear. Tiny claws scratched softly inside walls while Europe slept above them. The plague no longer belonged only to the harbor ships drifting beside the Sicilian coast. It had entered the deeper veins of civilization itself, carried through commerce, movement, hunger, and ordinary human closeness. And as winter nights deepened across the Mediterranean world, the sickness continued outward beyond Messina toward the great trading cities of Europe, following roads and sea routes that connected kingdoms together beneath cold stars and distant church bells. The great Mediterranean ports remained alive with movement, even as fear slowly settled into their streets like evening fog. In Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and Constantinople, merchants still unloaded cargo beneath the cries of gulls and the creaking of wooden cranes beside the water. The sea had long been the lifeblood of Europe's commerce. Ships carried grain, silk, oil, timber, and spices between distant civilizations, linking kingdoms together through endless motion across dark waters. To close the ports entirely would have seemed almost unimaginable, and yet whispers traveled faster now than the ships themselves. Sailors arriving from Sicily spoke of sudden fevers spreading through Messina. Some described entire crews collapsing during voyages. Others claimed strange swellings appeared upon the sick before death followed only days later. At first, city officials listened cautiously without fully believing the scale of the danger. Rumors often grew larger during long journeys across the sea. Medieval life already contained enough uncertainty that people learned to treat frightening stories carefully. But the sickness kept arriving. In crowded harbors, dockworkers began disappearing from their posts after falling ill at home. Tavern owners noticed fewer sailors gathering at night beside the firelight. Priests received increasing requests to visit homes where fever spread behind closed shutters. Physicians walked narrow alleys carrying herbs, vinegar, and incense while searching desperately for patterns hidden within the suffering around them. The streets themselves slowly began to change. Markets that once overflowed with noise grew quieter after sunset. Families hurried indoors before nightfall. Mothers warned children not to wander near the docks where foreign ships continued arriving beneath gray skies. In some cities, smoke from burning herbs drifted constantly through the air because many believed disease traveled through poisonous vapors carried by wind and foul smells. Authorities struggled to respond to something they could neither explain nor control. Some officials ordered ships isolated outside harbor walls before unloading cargo. Others attempted to ban travelers arriving from infected regions. Guards inspected vessels more carefully while merchants argued angrily over lost profits and delayed trade. Yet every effort felt uncertain, almost fragile against the invisible movement of the plague itself. Europe possessed walls against armies and fortresses against invaders, but no defenses against unseen sickness carried silently through ordinary human contact. At night, fear deepened beneath candlelight. Churches filled with worried citizens whispering prayers into the darkness while bells echoed above the sleeping street. Some people believed the plague represented divine punishment for human sin. Others searched the heavens for signs within unusual weather, eclipses, or comets crossing the sky. Medieval society understood the world through faith, symbolism, and mystery, and so catastrophe naturally became tangled with spiritual questions no one could answer completely. Meanwhile, the ports continued breathing in travelers from across the known world. Beneath wooden docks, rats slipped quietly through shadows unnoticed. Fleas traveled hidden within blankets, sacks, and clothing carried inland by merchants and pilgrims. The disease moved steadily outward from the coast, following roads into villages and cities far beyond the sea. And across Europe, beneath the tolling bells and drifting smoke of medieval life, ordinary people slowly began realizing that the world they trusted was changing into something unfamiliar, fearful, and impossibly difficult to escape. Winter roads stretched endlessly beyond the port cities, carrying merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and wandering travelers deeper into the heart of Europe. Wagons creaked slowly through forests darkened by cold rain while horses exhaled pale clouds into the freezing air. Inns glowed softly beside muddy crossroads where strangers gathered around fires to share bread, wine, and stories from distant lands. For centuries, these roads had connected kingdoms together through trade and movement, allowing ideas, goods, and cultures to pass between cities beneath cathedral bells and castle towers. Now they carried something else as well. The plague moved quietly along the same paths merchants trusted and pilgrims preyed upon. It traveled hidden within carts of grain, beneath blankets carried by travelers, inside crowded inns where exhausted strangers slept side by side through bitter nights. No border stopped it. No lord fully understood how to defend against it. The roads themselves seemed almost alive with invisible motion spreading steadily outward from the Mediterranean coast toward the interior of Europe. At first, many villages still felt untouched by the growing fear. Farmers continued working frozen fields beneath gray skies while smoke rose peacefully from cottage chimneys. Children followed muddy paths between homes carrying firewood in cold hands. Priests rang bells for morning prayer exactly as they always had. Yet rumors arrived before the sickness itself. Travelers spoke quietly of strange deaths in distant towns. Some described ports where entire streets had fallen silent. Others claimed ships drifted into harbors filled only with corpses and fevered survivors too weak to stand. The stories sounded impossible. And still they continued spreading from village to village beside the winter roads. In monasteries along the countryside, monks recorded unusual reports arriving from southern Europe. Merchants crossing mountain passes noticed abandoned wagons left beside the roadside after illness overtook their owners. Certain inns began refusing unfamiliar travelers after hearing whispers of plague moving inland from the sea. Fear traveled ahead of the disease like a cold wind before a storm, but the movement of people never fully stopped. Europe depended upon these roads. Grain had to reach cities before hunger arrived. Messengers still carried royal orders between kingdoms. Pilgrims continued journeys toward holy shrines believing faith itself would protect them from danger. Every mile traveled carried the possibility of spreading the sickness farther into the continent. At night, beneath candlelight flickering inside roadside inns, uncertainty settled heavily over ordinary conversation. Travelers watched one another more carefully now. A single cough could quiet an entire room. Men who once shared tables freely sometimes chose distant corners instead, eating silently while winter winds moved against the walls outside. And beyond the warmth of the fires, the roads stretched onward through forests, valleys, and sleeping villages beneath dark skies filled with stars. The plague followed them patiently. By the time spring approached, the sickness no longer belonged only to Sicily or the great ports of the Mediterranean. It had entered France, northern Italy, and regions beyond the Alps. The medieval world remained connected through endless movement, and those very connections now carried catastrophe across Europe with unstoppable calmness. Still, many people hoped the danger might somehow pass them by. They could not yet imagine how many roads would soon grow empty. The first empty villages did not announce themselves with dramatic ruin or burning streets. Often they appeared quietly beside the roads, almost peaceful beneath gray skies and drifting fog. Travelers approaching from distant towns sometimes noticed the silence first. No smoke rose from chimneys, no dogs barked behind wooden fences. Church bells that once marked the passing hours no longer echoed across the fields. The world simply seemed to stop. In small farming communities scattered across Italy and southern France, the plague moved with terrifying speed once it arrived. Families who had lived side by side for generations became sick within days of one another. At first, neighbors still tried to help, carrying water and bread to homes where fever spread behind closed doors. Priests walked from cottage to cottage offering prayers beside candlelight while listening to frightened confessions from people who feared death approaching faster than understanding itself. But eventually, fear became stronger than closeness. As the sickness worsened, some villages found themselves without enough healthy people to care for the ill. Farmers weakened in their own beds while fields remained untouched beneath cold spring rain. Horses wandered loose beside empty barns. Half-finished meals rested silently upon wooden tables inside homes where entire families had disappeared into sickness and death almost together. Travelers passing through these settlements later described an eerie stillness hanging over the street. Doors remained slightly open where frightened residents had fled into the countryside hoping distance might protect them. Laundry moved gently in the wind beside abandoned cottages. Wells stood untouched in village squares once crowded crowded with ordinary conversation and daily life. In certain places, only the sound of birds or distant church bells disturbed the silence. The plague transformed absence itself into something hauntingly visible. For medieval Europe, villages represented stability and continuity. Generations were born, married, and buried upon the same land beneath the protection of familiar churches and local traditions. Most people expected life to continue through repetition: planting, harvest, winter, prayer. The disappearance of entire communities felt almost unnatural, as though the foundations of the world itself had begun quietly breaking apart. And still, the sickness spread onward. Messengers carried reports of abandoned settlements to nearby towns, deepening fear across the countryside. Some villages attempted to block strangers from entering altogether. Guards stood watch beside roads while anxious priests organized public prayers asking for divine mercy. Yet no wall or boundary fully stopped the movement of disease through a continent built upon constant human travel and trade. At night, survivors sometimes listened from isolated farmhouses while distant bells rang for the dead somewhere beyond the hills. The sound carried through darkness with terrible clarity. Inside monasteries, monks began recording entire communities lost within remarkably short periods of time. In certain regions, roads grew emptier each week as merchants avoided infected areas whenever possible. Even the natural rhythms of medieval life seemed disturbed. Markets shrank, fields went unplanted, familiar voices disappeared from taverns and churches, and across Europe people slowly realized the plague was not merely another passing illness. Something far larger had entered their world, something capable of emptying homes, silencing villages, and leaving entire landscapes suspended in lonely stillness beneath the cold skies of history. At first the bells rang only occasionally, a single slow toll drifting through the cold morning air, then another later that evening from a church farther down the valley. In medieval Europe, funeral bells were familiar sounds, woven naturally into ordinary life beside prayer, harvest, and worship. Illness and hardship had always existed close to human existence. Most people expected to hear the bells from time to time, echoing softly above rooftops while villagers paused briefly before returning to their daily routines. But during the years of the plague, the bells began to change. In towns across Italy and France, the sound no longer arrived as an isolated moment of mourning. The ringing became constant, almost rhythmic, passing from one church tower to another across crowded streets and frozen fields. Dawn bells mourned the dead before sunrise. Evening bells followed before candlelight filled the windows. Sometimes the ringing continued through the night itself, heavy and unbroken beneath drifting fog and cold stars. For many people, the sound became impossible to escape. Inside narrow homes lit by weak firelight, families listened silently while the bells echoed through darkness beyond their shutters. Mothers held sleeping children closer beneath wool blankets. Elderly men stared into fading embers while counting each distant toll almost unconsciously. Every sound seemed to carry a question no one wished to ask aloud. Who had died now, and how long before the bells rang again for someone else? The plague reshaped not only bodies and cities but the emotional rhythm of everyday life itself. Medieval communities lived closely together. Neighbors knew one another's families, routines, and histories across generations. When death arrived repeatedly within such intimate worlds, grief ceased to feel distant or occasional. It settled permanently into ordinary existence like winter rain soaking slowly into stone. In crowded towns, funeral processions moved through the streets so frequently that some people stopped approaching windows to watch them pass. Priests walked beside simple wooden carts carrying bodies wrapped in cloth while candle flames trembled against the wind. The smell of smoke, incense, damp earth, and sickness lingered constantly in the air. Beneath gray skies, Europe itself seemed to breathe more slowly, and still the bells continued ringing. For the deeply religious world of medieval Europe, church bells carried spiritual meaning beyond mere announcement. Their sound marked time, prayer, celebration, and mourning together. Many believed the bells could guide souls toward heaven or protect communities from evil through sacred vibrations spreading across the land. During the plague, however, the endless tolling began to feel almost unbearable to some listeners, as though the churches themselves were struggling to keep pace with death. Certain priests grew exhausted from performing funeral rites without pause. Graveyards filled faster than workers could dig new ground. Entire families sometimes disappeared within a single week, leaving neighbors to whisper prayers travelers over hastily prepared burials beneath cold rain and drifting mist. Yet amid the sorrow, life continued in strange and fragile ways. Markets still opened each morning, though more quietly than before. Bakers kneaded dough beside warm ovens while bells echoed faintly through the streets outside. Monks copied manuscripts beneath candlelight. Children still laughed occasionally in narrow alleys before falling silent again at the sound of another distant toll. And across Europe, from isolated villages to crowded cities, the funeral bells became the voice of an age slowly learning the scale of its own catastrophe. Night after night, beneath cathedral towers and darkening skies, they reminded humanity that the plague was no longer approaching. It had fully arrived. The cities of Europe had once been filled with movement that rarely stopped. Market sellers called out beneath cathedral walls. Blacksmiths hammered iron beside crowded streets. Horses pulled wagons through narrow lanes while smoke rose steadily from ovens, workshops, and countless fireplaces pressed tightly together inside stone neighborhoods. Medieval cities were loud places, alive with trade, labor, argument, prayer, and survival. But as the plague deepened, another atmosphere slowly settled over them. The smoke remained, the silence arrived beside it. In Florence, Paris, Venice, and countless smaller towns scattered across Europe, the streets began changing in ways people could feel long before they fully understood them. Certain shops no longer opened at dawn. Tavern doors stayed closed through entire evening. Windows remained shuttered even after sunrise because sickness waited inside homes where families whispered prayers beside fevered beds. At first, the cities still tried to continue normally. Merchants insisted trade must survive. Priests urged communities toward faith and discipline. Officials attempted to maintain order through decrees and public announcements read aloud in crowded squares. Yet beneath the routines of urban life, fear moved quietly from neighbor to neighbor like cold wind slipping beneath a locked door. The plague spread fastest where humanity lived closest together. Inside medieval cities, entire families often shared single dark rooms above workshops or beside narrow alleys where waste collected beneath the rain. Rats moved freely through walls, markets, docks, and crowded food stores. Water sources became contaminated easily. Air itself felt heavy within streets packed tightly between tall buildings that blocked sunlight and trapped smoke from thousands of fires. When illness entered these environments, it moved with terrifying speed. People began noticing strange patterns emerging around them. Entire buildings fell silent within days. Familiar faces vanished from marketplaces without explanation. Priests walked constantly between homes carrying oils, candles, and prayers while physicians searched helplessly for remedies that never truly arrived. The smell of the cities changed too. Smoke from burning herbs drifted through the streets because many believed strong scents could cleanse poisoned air. Fires burned constantly inside homes attempting to fight corruption and disease through heat. Meanwhile, the odors of sickness, sweat, damp stone, human waste, and death slowly merged together beneath the gray skies hanging over Europe's urban centers. At night, the atmosphere became almost dreamlike. Church bells echoed across rooftops while torchlight flickered through fog-filled alleys. Wagons carrying bodies rolled quietly toward burial grounds outside the city walls. Somewhere distant, someone coughed behind thin wooden shutters. Somewhere else, a priest whispered final prayers beside candlelight already burning low. And between these sounds came stretches of unnatural stillness. The plague altered how people looked at one another. In crowded streets, strangers stepped aside nervously after hearing even a single cough. Some citizens covered their faces with cloth soaked in vinegar or perfume. Others refused visitors entirely, sealing themselves inside homes filled with fear and uncertainty. Yet escape rarely remained possible for long. The cities themselves had become traps built from density, commerce, and human closeness. Medieval Europe depended upon crowded marketplaces, shared labor, and constant movement between neighborhoods. The very structures that allowed cities to thrive now helped the plague spread relentlessly through them. Still, beneath the fear, fragments of ordinary life endured. Bakers rose before dawn to prepare bread. Candle makers continued working beside warm wax and smoke. Monks copied manuscripts while funeral bells echoed faintly beyond monastery walls. Humanity persisted even while surrounded by loss. But across Europe, the great cities that once symbolized prosperity and civilization were becoming places of smoke, silence, and growing emotional exhaustion. And with each passing week, fewer people believed the old world would ever fully return again. By the middle years of the plague, physicians had become familiar figures moving through the streets of Europe, though familiarity brought little comfort anymore. People watched them pass beneath torchlight and drifting smoke with a mixture of hope and quiet despair. Some rode slowly on horseback between neighborhoods filled with sickness. Others walked through narrow alleys carrying leather satchels packed with herbs, oils, handwritten remedies, and instruments that rarely changed the fate waiting behind closed doors. Medicine in the medieval world existed somewhere between observation, religion, philosophy, and ancient tradition. Physicians studied the writings of Greek and Roman scholars preserved carefully across centuries inside monasteries and universities. Many believed illness emerged from imbalance within the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Others blamed poisoned air, corrupted weather, or invisible spiritual forces moving through creation itself. The plague shattered certainty faster than explanations could keep pace. As death spread through the cities, doctors searched desperately for patterns hidden within the suffering surrounding them. They examined swollen glands darkening beneath the skin. They listened to ragged breathing inside overcrowded homes where entire families burned with fever together. Remedies multiplied from fear as much as knowledge: vinegar baths, crushed herbs, incense smoke, heated oils, bloodletting, prayer. Nothing truly stopped the sickness, and so the physicians themselves slowly became strange symbols within the imagination of Europe. In later years, certain plague doctors became known for the long dark robes and bird-like masks they wore while treating patients. Though not every physician dressed this way during the earliest outbreaks, the image would eventually grow famous across history. Hollow glass eyes staring from leather beaks stuffed with flowers, spices, lavender, mint, and rose petals meant to filter poisoned air before it entered the lung. To medieval people, the appearance felt unsettling and almost unreal. At night, beneath candlelight and drifting fog, these figures moved silently through streets filled with funeral bells and whispered prayers. Their black robes brushed against wet stone while frightened citizens watched from shuttered windows above. The beaked masks transformed ordinary healers into something almost dreamlike, caught somewhere between science, ritual, and fear. Yet behind the strange appearance stood exhausted human beings struggling against helplessness. Many physicians continued working even after realizing they possessed few real answers. They entered infected homes daily knowing the risk surrounding them. Some fell sick beside the very patients they tried to save. Others survived physically while carrying emotional exhaustion that deepened with every passing week. To healers trained to restore balance and preserve life, the plague felt like watching the natural order collapse faster than human understanding itself. Inside universities and monasteries, scholars argued over causes while Europe continued dying around them. Some blamed unusual alignments of planets. Others believed earthquakes had released poisonous vapors into the atmosphere from beneath the earth. Religious leaders urged repentance. Physicians recommended isolation whenever possible. Yet despite every theory and remedy, the plague moved steadily onward across cities, villages, monasteries, castles, and roads alike. And still people searched for comfort wherever they could find it. A physician arriving at a home with candles and medicine at least offered the feeling that someone was trying to resist the darkness. Even false remedies carried emotional weight in a world desperate for hope. Families listened carefully to every instruction. They burned herbs beside bedsides. They whispered prayers while doctors examined the sick beneath trembling candlelight. Outside, the bells continued ringing through the cold European nights. And beneath the smoke, fear, and strange masks of the plague years, humanity struggled painfully toward understanding in a world where death still moved faster than knowledge. As the plague tightened its hold upon Europe, the churches began filling long after sunset. In ordinary years, most medieval towns grew quieter at night. Candles dimmed behind shuttered windows. Families gathered beside small fires while cold winds moved through narrow streets outside. But during the years of sickness, sleep itself became difficult for many people. Fear lingered too heavily in the darkness. And so they turned toward the churches. Beneath towering stone cathedrals and humble village chapels alike, people arrived carrying grief, exhaustion, and questions too large for ordinary conversation. Candle flames flickered against painted walls while priests whispered prayers that echoed softly through enormous chambers filled with incense smoke and shadows. Some worshippers knelt silently for hours. Others wept openly beside wooden pews worn smooth by generations of hands and knees before them. The medieval world understood suffering through faith. For most people, religion was not separate from daily life but woven deeply into existence itself. Birth, marriage, harvest, illness, and death all moved beneath beneath the presence of God and the Church. When the plague arrived with such overwhelming force, many searched desperately for spiritual meaning hidden within the catastrophe unfolding around them. Had humanity sinned too greatly? Was the plague punishment? Or was it some divine mystery beyond mortal understanding? Inside the churches, these questions hung heavily beneath the candlelight. Priests worked endlessly during the worst years of the plague. They heard confessions late into the night from frightened citizens terrified of dying without forgiveness. They carried holy oils into infected homes where entire families waited beside fever and silence. Many clergy members became sick themselves after remaining constantly among the dying, yet still, they continued walking through the streets with lanterns and prayer books in trembling hands. At times, the churches offered comfort. The slow rhythm of prayer calmed frightened minds. Familiar hymns echoed through stone halls with soothing repetition while candlelight created warmth against the cold uncertainty outside. For a few quiet moments, worshippers could feel surrounded by something stable and eternal within a world changing too quickly to understand. Yet even the churches could not escape the plague completely. In certain cities, funerals became so frequent that priests struggled to keep pace with the dead. Graveyards overflowed beside cathedral walls, the smell of incense mixed with sickness and damp winter air. Some worshippers began questioning why prayers seemed unable to stop the suffering surrounding them. Others clung to faith more intensely than ever before, believing only divine mercy could carry humanity through the darkness now covering Europe. At night, the atmosphere inside the churches became almost dreamlike. Thousands of candles glowed beneath vaulted ceilings while bells echoed faintly beyond the walls. Shadows moved softly across ancient stone pillars. Somewhere nearby, a grieving mother whispered prayers beside clasped hands. Somewhere else, exhausted monks sang quietly together while outside the streets remained cold and nearly empty beneath drifting fog. And through it all, the plague continued moving silently between homes, marketplaces, monasteries, and kingdoms alike. Still, the churches remained open. Not because they possessed answers powerful enough to stop the sickness, but because human beings needed somewhere to carry their fear, sorrow, and loneliness while the old world seemed to crumble around them. Beneath the candlelight of medieval Europe, faith became both refuge and question at the same time. And through the long nights of the plague years, countless souls gathered inside sacred stone walls searching for comfort while funeral bells echoed endlessly through the darkness beyond. Fear rarely remained still for long. As the plague continued spreading across Europe, grief slowly began changing into suspicion. In frightened towns already exhausted by death and uncertainty, people searched desperately for explanations simple enough to hold onto. The sickness moved invisibly, arriving without warning and striking rich and poor alike. Because no one truly understood how the disease traveled, fear itself started turning outward toward neighbors, strangers, and anyone who seemed unfamiliar within communities already trembling beneath constant loss. At first, the changes appeared quietly. Conversations in marketplaces became shorter and more cautious. Travelers arriving from distant regions faced uneasy stares before entering city gates. Families avoided homes where sickness had recently appeared. In crowded streets, people stepped aside nervously from anyone coughing beneath the cold air. Human closeness itself, once necessary for survival in medieval life, slowly became tangled with danger. And where understanding disappears, blame often follows. Throughout Europe, rumors spread almost as quickly as the plague itself. Some believed certain groups had poisoned wells or corrupted food supplies. Others whispered that foreigners carried curses from distant lands beyond Christian Europe. Old suspicions and long-standing prejudices deepened beneath the pressure of fear. Communities already overwhelmed by suffering searched desperately for reasons that made catastrophe feel less random, less impossible to control. In some towns, accusations emerged against neighbors who behaved differently or seemed untouched by illness while others died around them. Quiet people became objects of suspicion. Outsiders faced growing hostility. Fear transformed ordinary misunderstandings into imagined threats because frightened minds longed for certainty in a world where none existed anymore. Yet beneath these tensions remained profound exhaustion. Most people were not driven by cruelty alone, but by terror so constant it reshaped how they viewed one another. Medieval society depended deeply upon trust within villages, markets, churches, and families. The plague damaged those invisible bonds slowly and painfully. When death appeared in nearly every street, even familiar faces began carrying unspoken anxiety. Could this person unknowingly bring sickness into my home? Could proximity itself become fatal? At night, whispers moved through candlelit rooms where families discussed rumors heard earlier in crowded marketplaces or church gatherings. Some stories described poisoned wells, others spoke of hidden conspiracies or divine punishment aimed at specific communities. Priests often urged compassion and unity, but fear proved difficult to calm once it settled deeply inside the imagination of Europe. And still the plague continued spreading without discrimination. The sickness ignored religion, language, wealth, and innocence alike. It entered castles, monasteries, fishing villages, and crowded cities with equal silence. Yet human beings struggled emotionally against the idea of random suffering on such enormous scale. Searching for blame became one way to make catastrophe feel understandable, even if the explanations only created further pain and division. In certain regions, violence eventually followed suspicion. Communities turned against vulnerable groups already living at the edges of society. Ancient prejudices hardened beneath grief and panic. The plague revealed not only humanity's fragility before disease, but also the dangerous ways fear can reshape compassion into mistrust. And beneath the tolling bells of medieval Europe, neighbors who once shared bread, prayer, and daily life together sometimes began looking at one another through the cold, uncertain shadow of survival itself. The world was no longer merely sick. It was becoming emotionally fractured as well. By the height of the plague years, death had become too vast for the old rituals of mourning to contain. For centuries, medieval Europe had treated burial as something sacred and deeply personal. Families gathered beside candlelight to pray over the dead. Church bells marked each passing soul with solemn care. Bodies were washed gently, wrapped properly, and carried through familiar streets toward consecrated ground where generations already rested beneath stone crosses and quiet earth. But the plague changed the scale of death itself. In city after city, the number of bodies began rising faster than priests, grave diggers, or grieving families could manage. Funeral processions that once moved slowly with dignity now blended together endlessly beneath gray skies. Bells rang almost without pause, cemeteries filled beyond their wall. Fresh graves covered older ones before the soil had fully settled. And through the streets came the wagons. At dawn, before markets opened and before weak winter sunlight reached the narrow alleys, workers pushed wooden carts through the cities collecting the dead from homes already marked by silence. The wheels creaked against wet stones while horses breathed pale mist into the freezing air. Sometimes a bell rang softly beside the wagon as warning, sometimes there was only quiet. Families often watched helplessly from windows or doorways as loved ones disappeared beneath rough cloth coverings alongside neighbors, strangers, and entire households gathered together by catastrophe. The speed of the plague allowed little time for the long rituals medieval people once depended upon to process grief properly. Mourning itself became hurried beneath necessity. For the workers who handled the dead each day, emotional exhaustion settled deeply into the soul. Grave diggers rose before sunrise and labored until darkness beside endless trenches carved into frozen ground. Their hands stiffened from cold mud and constant labor. Priests whispered shortened prayers over mass burials because hundreds waited behind them still needing burial before nightfall. Some workers eventually stopped speaking much at all except when necessary. Repetition numbed the mind as death became part of the ordinary rhythm of existence. Yet even amid the horror, small moments of humanity endured. A priest pausing beside one child longer than required. A gravedigger quietly placing a blanket more carefully across a body before burial. A widow whispering one final prayer into the cold morning air before the wagon disappeared down the street. These gestures became fragile acts of dignity within a world struggling to keep pace with loss. At night, the wagons sometimes continued moving beneath torchlight through streets nearly emptied of ordinary life. Smoke drifted between rooftops while distant bells echoed through fog and darkness. Behind shuttered windows, frightened families listened to the sounds outside and imagined the wheels passing slowly through the city below. Many wondered whether their own homes would soon hear that same knock upon the door. The plague altered humanity's relationship with death itself. Medieval Europe had always lived close to mortality through famine, war, and illness, yet people still expected death to arrive individually, accompanied by ritual, prayer, and remembrance. The Black Death shattered those expectations. Loss became too enormous, too constant, too overwhelming for the old emotional structures to fully contain. And across Europe, from crowded cities to isolated villages, the endless wagons rolled onward beneath cold skies, carrying the dead through a civilization slowly collapsing beneath the weight of its own grief. Still the bells rang, still the candles burned low beside silent windows, and still humanity endured even while surrounded by unimaginable sorrow. When the plague finally began to loosen its grip upon certain parts of Europe, the continent that remained no longer resembled the world that had existed before. The bells still rang across villages and cathedral towns, but beneath their echoes stretched landscapes touched by absence. Roads once crowded with carts and merchants now felt strangely open beneath wide gray skies. Entire regions carried a silence that seemed older somehow, as though time itself had slowed beside the enormous weight of loss. And beyond the towns and city walls lay the empty field. For generations, medieval Europe had depended upon endless human labor tied closely to the land. Farmers rose before sunrise to plow fields, repair fences, tend animals, and prepare harvests that sustained villages through long winters. Every season followed familiar rhythms repeated across centuries. Wheat ripened beneath summer light. Sheep moved slowly across hillsides. Smoke drifted upward from cottages standing beside cultivated earth carefully worked by countless hands. But after the plague, many of those hands were gone. Across England, France, Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, travelers began passing farms where crops rotted untouched beneath rain and wind. Wooden plows sat abandoned near fields already overtaken by weeds. Barn doors creaked softly in empty farmyards while animals wandered without owners through neglected pastures. In some places, entire households had disappeared so completely that neighboring villages simply left the land behind rather than attempt to reclaim it. Nature moved quietly into the emptiness. Grass spread across forgotten roads leading toward isolated cottages. Forests slowly pushed outward into abandoned farmland where no one remained to cut trees or clear brush. Birds nested in silent barns once filled with livestock and conversation. Rivers flowed past empty mills whose wheels no longer turned beside the current. Europe itself seemed to breathe differently now beneath the long shadow of the plague. For survivors, the sight carried deep emotional weight. The medieval world had always felt permanent to those living inside it. Families expected children and grandchildren to continue working the same land for generations beneath the protection of familiar churches and local customs. The abandonment of farms and villages shattered that sense of continuity. Empty fields became visible reminders that entire pieces of human life had simply vanished from history within only a few terrible years. At night, lonely winds moved across uncultivated land where harvest songs once echoed during autumn evening. Travelers resting beside roadside fires sometimes passed darkened farmhouses standing motionless beneath the moonlight, their windows empty and roofs slowly collapsing inward from neglect and weather. Yet amid the silence, change had already begun quietly reshaping Europe. With so many laborers dead, surviving workers became suddenly more valuable than before. Landowners struggled desperately to maintain estates without enough hands to cultivate the soil. Some peasants who survived the plague discovered they could now demand better wages, lighter obligations, or opportunities previously unimaginable within the rigid structure of medieval society. The old order had weakened. And though most people could not yet fully see it, the empty fields stretching across Europe marked more than tragedy alone. They signaled the beginning of transformation beneath the sorrow. Still, for those who walked through the abandoned countryside during those years, the emotional reality remained painfully immediate. The silence felt unnatural. The absence lingered everywhere. Beneath drifting clouds and fading daylight, Europe looked like a civilization slowly learning how fragile even the oldest human worlds can become once enough voices disappear from the land forever. The plague did more than empty villages and silence church bells. It quietly altered the balance of power that had shaped medieval Europe for centuries. Before the sickness, most ordinary laborers possessed very little control over their lives. Vast estates belonged to nobles, monasteries, and wealthy landowners who depended upon enormous numbers of peasants to cultivate fields, repair roads, harvest grain, and maintain the rhythms of feudal society. For generations, survival itself often required obedience. Land was precious, work was endless, and poor families rarely possessed the freedom to demand better conditions because there were always more laborers waiting to replace them. Then the plague carried millions away. Suddenly the world felt strangely reversed. Across Europe, surviving workers became scarce in ways medieval society had never experienced before. Fields still needed planting, livestock required care, roads demanded repair. Yet countless estates no longer possessed enough people to maintain even basic labor. Noble families who once commanded obedience now found themselves searching desperately for workers willing to remain on the land. And for the first time in many lives, ordinary peasants realized their labor carried new power. In England and parts of France, surviving farmers began requesting higher wages or reduced obligations in exchange for their work. Some left the estates where their families had served for generations and traveled toward regions offering better opportunities. Others negotiated directly with landlords who could no longer afford to lose even a few healthy laborers after entire villages had disappeared. The change unfolded slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first. Yet beneath the surface of daily life, medieval Europe itself was beginning to transform. For wealthy landowners, the shift created deep unease. The old social order had always depended upon stability and hierarchy. Lords ruled over estates, peasants worked the land. The structure seemed as permanent as the stone castles overlooking the countryside. But after the plague, labor became valuable enough that survival itself sometimes required negotiation rather than command. Some rulers attempted to resist these changes. Laws emerged in certain kingdoms limiting wages or preventing peasants from leaving estates freely in search of better work elsewhere. Authorities feared the collapse of traditional order if common laborers gained too much independence. Yet enforcing such rules became increasingly difficult inside a continent still weakened by loss and population decline. Meanwhile, ordinary people slowly discovered new possibilities within the ruins left behind by catastrophe. A surviving blacksmith might inherit abandoned property from relatives who had died. A farm laborer could suddenly afford food once impossible to obtain regularly before the plague. Some families moved into homes left empty for years. Markets changed, prices shifted. Entire local economies adapted unevenly to a world where human labor had become one of the most precious resources remaining. At night, beneath candlelight flickering inside cottages and manor houses alike, Europe entered a quieter kind of uncertainty. The plague had not only killed millions, it had weakened invisible assumptions that once held medieval society together. The relationship between rich and poor, ruler and laborer, lord and servant no longer felt entirely fixed beneath the old traditions. And though grief still lingered across the continent, another emotion slowly emerged beside it: possibility. Not hopeful in any simple way and not free from suffering, but real nonetheless. Across abandoned fields and recovering towns, survivors began building lives inside a changed world where catastrophe had unexpectedly altered the meaning of work, value, and power itself. The old Europe had not vanished completely, but beneath the silence left by the plague, a different kind of society was beginning quietly to rise. The great estates of medieval Europe still stood after the plague, their stone halls and watchtowers rising above fields touched by silence. Lords continued holding authority over vast stretches of land inherited across generations. Heraldic banners still moved in the wind above castle walls. Servants lit fires inside long dining chambers while priests conducted prayers within private chapels built for noble families who once believed their power would endure unchanged forever. Yet beneath the appearance of stability, something fragile had begun quietly breaking apart. Before the plague, noble households depended upon enormous networks of labor to maintain daily life. Peasants farmed the surrounding land. Servants prepared food, repaired buildings, cleaned halls, cared for horses, and managed storage rooms filled with grain and supplies. The feudal world functioned through countless invisible routines repeated season after season beneath strict social hierarchy. But after the plague, many of those workers were gone. Across Europe, noble families struggled to preserve estates that suddenly felt too large, too empty, and too difficult to sustain. Entire villages attached to manors had disappeared into sickness. Fields remained uncultivated because no laborers survived to work them. Some castles still projected strength from a distance, yet inside their walls the rhythms of aristocratic life had slowed beneath exhaustion and absence. In certain households, only a handful of servants remained where dozens once moved constantly through kitchens, stables, and courtyards. Fires burned in fewer rooms during winter. Banquet halls that once hosted crowded gatherings now echoed strangely beneath candlelight and silence. Wealth itself became harder to maintain when the human structure supporting it had weakened so deeply. For many nobles, the plague introduced an unfamiliar feeling: helplessness. Power could command armies and collect taxes, but it could not force dead laborers back into the fields. Gold could purchase imported silk and wine, yet it could not easily restore the old certainty that medieval hierarchy would continue unchanged forever. Even great families who survived physically often found themselves financially strained by shrinking populations and abandoned land. Meanwhile, surviving peasants gained quiet leverage simply by remaining alive. Some laborers left estates offering poor treatment and sought better opportunities elsewhere. Others negotiated lower rents or higher wages because landlords could no longer replace workers so easily. Across parts of Europe, tensions slowly emerged between nobles attempting to preserve traditional authority and workers realizing the balance beneath society had shifted. At night, candlelight flickered through castle windows overlooking darkened countryside where abandoned farms rested beneath drifting fog. Noblemen studied ledgers showing declining harvests and empty villages. Steward after steward reported shortages of labor impossible to solve quickly. The old feudal order still existed, but it no longer felt invincible. And emotionally, the plague altered the psychology of power itself. Death had entered both cottages and castles without respect for title or bloodline. Lords watched family members fall sick beside servants and laborers alike. Priests buried noble heirs beside ordinary villagers within the same exhausted graveyard. For a civilization deeply shaped by hierarchy, the plague created an unsettling awareness that mortality ignored social rank completely. The castles remained standing, the banners still flew. But across Europe, beneath fading candlelight and quiet winter skies, the authority that had once seemed eternal now carried the first subtle signs of decline. The lords still ruled their lands, yet the world beneath them had already begun changing into something new. The children who survived the plague years grew up inside a world permanently shaped by absence. Before the sickness, medieval childhood had unfolded within crowded households and busy villages where generations lived closely together beneath familiar routines. Children learned trades beside parents and relatives. They followed older siblings through marketplaces, fields, and church festivals alive with music, conversation, and seasonal rhythms repeated across centuries. The world felt stable because the people inside it remained familiar year after year. But after the plague, many children awoke into silence where entire parts of that world had vanished. Some lost parents within days of one another. Others watched older brothers, sisters, or grandparents disappear behind fevered illness they could barely understand. In countless homes across Europe, empty chairs remained beside fireplaces where voices once gathered each evening beneath candlelight and prayer. The emotional landscape of childhood itself became filled with grief too large for young minds to fully explain, yet life continued around them. Children still carried water through narrow streets. They still helped tend animals and gather firewood beneath cold skies, but many performed these ordinary tasks inside communities forever altered by loss. Certain village roads no longer echoed with familiar laughter. Some schools and monasteries stood quieter than before because fewer students remained. Entire generations grew up hearing stories about relatives and neighbors they could no longer remember clearly themselves. The plague became part of memory even for those too young to understand it fully. At night, survivors sometimes listened to adults speaking softly about the years of sickness after believing children had already fallen asleep. They heard fragments of fearful conversations beside fading fires, stories of funeral bells, abandoned homes, and winters when death seemed endless. Such memories settled quietly into the emotional atmosphere surrounding childhood, shaping how young people viewed the fragility of life itself. For many children, the world no longer felt guaranteed. And yet, beneath the sorrow, resilience slowly emerged. Orphaned children were often raised by surviving relatives or monasteries trying to rebuild communities weakened by catastrophe. Young apprentices entered trades once controlled by older workers who had died during the plague. Some inherited land or property unexpectedly after entire family lines disappeared. The destruction of the old world created painful hardship, but also strange opportunities for those growing into adulthood afterward. Emotionally, however, the scars lingered deeply. Many survivors carried lifelong memories of watching sickness move through their homes while priests whispered prayers beside candlelight. Some children learned early how quickly ordinary life could vanish beneath forces no human fully controlled. Death no longer belonged only to old age or distant battlefield. It had entered kitchens, bedrooms, churches, and farms with terrifying intimacy. And still Europe continued forward. Spring returned to abandoned field. Markets slowly reopened reopened in recovering town. New families formed beneath the same cathedral bells that once rang endlessly for the dead. Children born after the worst years of the plague played beside village wells and monastery gardens without fully understanding how much the world around them had already changed. But the shadow remained. Across Europe, an entire generation matured inside the memory of catastrophe, carrying quiet emotional knowledge passed between survivors through stories, silences, and grief. They inherited not only the rebuilt world left after the plague, but also the lingering awareness that even the strongest civilizations can become fragile beneath the long and unpredictable movement of history itself. After the plague, Europe began dreaming differently about death. Before the Great Sickness, medieval art had often focused upon sacred glory, heavenly light, saints, kings, and divine order stretching peacefully across the world. Cathedral walls carried painted visions of paradise. Monks illuminated manuscripts with golden colors and delicate patterns beneath candlelight. Religious imagery offered comfort, structure, and eternal meaning inside a difficult but understandable universe. Then the plague arrived and transformed the imagination of an entire civilization. Across Europe, artists, priests, and ordinary people struggled to process suffering so enormous it seemed to reshape reality itself. Millions had vanished within only a few years. Villages stood empty, graveyards overflowed. Families carried memories of funeral bells and mass burials that lingered long after the sickness began fading from the streets. And slowly, death entered the art of Europe with new intimacy. Inside churches and monasteries, painters began creating images where skeletons walked beside kings and peasants alike, reminding viewers that mortality spared no one. Murals depicted the dance of death, silent processions in which noblemen, merchants, priests, children, and laborers moved together toward the grave beneath dark skies and fading candlelight. The imagery felt haunting but also strangely calm, as though medieval society was attempting to speak honestly about truths too visible now to ignore. Death had become part of everyday memory. In illuminated manuscripts, poems, and carvings upon cathedral walls, Europe reflected upon fragility with new emotional depth. Artists painted hourglasses beside skulls. Writers described crumbling kingdoms and fleeting human glory. Monks copied prayers emphasizing the temporary nature of earthly existence while candle flames trembled across the parchment during long winter nights. Yet beneath the darkness existed something deeply human. The plague did not destroy creativity. In many ways, it intensified it. People who survived catastrophe often searched more urgently for meaning, beauty, and remembrance. Across recovering towns, churches commissioned new memorials honoring the dead. Families preserved stories about lost relatives through songs, letters, and oral tradition. Art became not only a reflection of grief, but also an attempt to preserve emotional connection against the silence left behind by so much loss. At night, the atmosphere inside medieval cathedrals carried this emotional transformation visibly. Candlelight flickered across painted skeletons beside saints and angels. Incense smoke drifted upward beneath vaulted ceilings where prayers for the dead echoed softly through the darkness. The sacred and the mortal now stood closer together inside the imagination of Europe than ever before, and ordinary people understood these images immediately. A farmer staring at a mural of death leading humanity toward eternity no longer viewed it as distant symbolism alone. The plague had made mortality familiar to nearly everyone. Survivors had watched neighbors vanish, families collapse, and entire villages disappear beneath history's shadow. Art after the plague became quieter, more reflective, and often more emotionally honest about suffering itself. The old medieval world had believed stability might endure forever beneath God's order and royal power. The plague shattered that illusion. Yet from the grief emerged a deeper awareness of human fragility, memory, and time, themes that would continue shaping European art and thought for centuries afterward. And beneath the candlelight of monasteries and cathedrals, Europe slowly painted its sorrow into history so future generations would never fully forget the years when death walked beside every road and every prayer. When the plague finally loosened its grip upon Europe, the continent that emerged was not the same civilization that had existed before the bells first began to ring. The change did not happen suddenly. No single sunrise revealed a completely transformed world. Instead, Europe shifted slowly through years of recovery, grief, rebuilding, and quiet adaptation. Cities reopened their markets beneath cautious optimism. Fields once abandoned gradually returned to cultivation. Roads filled again with merchants, pilgrims, and travelers moving between kingdoms beneath familiar cathedral towers. Yet beneath these outward signs of renewal, renewal, history itself had turned. The plague had removed millions from the fabric of medieval society, leaving behind spaces that could never be filled exactly as they once were. Entire bloodlines vanished. Villages disappeared from maps. Monasteries lost generations of scholars and scribes. Noble families who once believed their power eternal found themselves weakened beside a changing social order. And in those empty spaces, a different Europe slowly began to emerge. Surviving laborers possessed more value than before. Old feudal structures weakened under the pressure of population loss and economic change. Some peasants gained freedoms unimaginable to earlier generations. Trade networks adapted. Cities reorganized themselves. Even the relationship between ordinary people and authority shifted quietly after witnessing how powerless kings, nobles, and priests had often seemed before the plague. Emotionally, the transformation ran even deeper. Europe no longer viewed life with the same certainty it once had beneath the candlelight of the early medieval world. The plague had taught an entire civilization that stability could vanish quickly. Prosperous cities could fall silent. Great families could disappear within weeks. Wealth and faith alone could not fully protect humanity from suffering woven into the natural world itself. Yet alongside that awareness came resilience. People rebuilt homes beside abandoned ruins. Children were born into towns still carrying memories of funeral bells. Farmers replanted fields where weeds once covered forgotten roads. Monks continued copying books and preserving knowledge beneath flickering candles despite everything history had taken from them. Humanity endured because it always had. At night, travelers moving across Europe during the decades after the plague sometimes passed landscapes where traces of both worlds existed together. Empty cottages rested beside newly cultivated farmland. Fresh church bells echoed above cemeteries expanded during the years of mass burial. In recovering marketplaces, merchants sold goods beside survivors who still remembered streets once filled entirely with silence and fear. The continent carried memory everywhere. And perhaps that memory changed Europe most of all. The plague forced medieval civilization to confront mortality not as distant philosophy but as shared reality. It altered art, labor, religion, politics, medicine, and the emotional imagination of generations afterward. Historians centuries later would look back upon these years not simply as a terrible disaster, but as a turning point dividing one era of European history from another. The old world had cracked beneath the weight of catastrophe. Something new slowly emerged through the fractures, not immediately brighter. Not free from suffering, but changed forever. And beneath quiet evening skies, as candlelight continued glowing behind monastery windows and village homes across the recovering continent, Europe moved cautiously forward into a future shaped permanently by the long shadow of the Black Death. Each evening, as the light faded from the narrow streets below, she moved quietly toward the window and waited. The house stood near the edge of a small Italian town where stone buildings leaned close together above winding roads polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. Before the plague, the street outside had rarely fallen silent. Merchants passed carrying baskets and cloth. Children chased one another beneath church bells drifting through the afternoon air. Neighbors paused beside doorways to exchange small pieces of daily life beneath hanging laundry and candlelit windows. Now most evenings carried only stillness. The mother wrapped a wool shawl tightly around her shoulders while cold twilight gathered beyond the glass. A single candle burned behind her, throwing soft gold against the wooden walls of the room where her youngest child slept quietly beneath blankets nearby. Somewhere farther across town, bells rang again for the dead, their slow rhythm dissolving into the winter air. She listened carefully each time footsteps appeared along the road below. Her husband had left days earlier searching for medicine after their oldest son developed fever and painful swelling along his neck. The physicians in town possessed little certainty anymore. Some prescribed herbs and vinegar. Others recommended prayer, heat, or smoke from burning flowers. Fear had spread faster than knowledge, and desperate families often traveled from village to village hoping someone somewhere still held answers untouched by the plague. So she waited. At first, neighbors had promised he would return quickly, but time moved strangely during the plague years. Hours stretched beneath anxiety while entire lives sometimes disappeared within only days. The mother no longer longer trusted the passing of time itself. Every distant wagon sounded like possibility. Every approaching figure emerging through the fog made her heart rise briefly before disappointment settled once more into silence. Inside the home, the atmosphere carried exhaustion deeper than sleep could repair. The youngest child coughed softly during the night while fever warmed the small room despite winter cold pressing against the shutters outside. Bowls of water stood untouched near the bedside. Candles burned lower with each passing evening. The mother whispered prayers beneath her breath almost constantly now, not because she fully expected miracles anymore, but because prayer gave shape to fear too large to carry silently. Beyond the window, the town itself felt altered beyond recognition. Certain homes remained completely dark after entire families vanished into sickness. Marketplaces that once overflowed with noise now emptied before sunset. People avoided lingering in the streets, moving quickly through the cold air with lowered eyes and covered faces. The plague had changed how human beings looked at one another. Even kindness carried hesitation now. Still, she waited by the window. Not only for her husband, but for the feeling that ordinary life might somehow return beside him. She waited for familiar footsteps on the stairs, for the sound of laughter from healthy children playing outside again, for mornings untouched by funeral bells and whispered fear. At night, snow sometimes gathered softly along the rooftops while candlelight flickered across the frozen streets below. The mother rested one hand against the cold glass and searched the darkness for movement beyond the drifting fog. And somewhere inside countless homes across plague-stricken Europe, others waited exactly the same way, listening for loved ones who had stepped into the uncertainty of the world outside, hoping the silence at the door would finally break before morning came again. The boy remembered the sound of the market before he remembered the silence that replaced it. Before the plague, the streets below his family's apartment had been filled each morning with movement and noise. Merchants shouted prices beside baskets of onions, bread, and fish fresh from the river. Horses pulled wooden carts across uneven stones while smoke drifted upward from bakeries already warm before sunrise. Women carried water between narrow buildings and church bells rolled across the rooftops with comforting familiarity. The world had once sounded alive. Now he stood beside the same window each day watching the streets grow emptier beneath gray skies. At first, the changes had seemed small enough for a child to misunderstand. One neighbor stopped opening his shop, then another family disappeared behind closed shutters after illness entered their home. Priests began walking more frequently through the roads carrying candles and whispered prayers. Adults spoke quietly when they believed children were not listening, but children always listen. The boy noticed how his mother pulled him closer whenever strangers passed nearby. He noticed how fewer wagons arrived from neighboring towns. He noticed how the bells sometimes rang before dawn and continued long after darkness covered the city. Most of all, he noticed the fear in the eyes of adults. That frightened him more than the sickness itself. Inside the apartment, life became smaller as winter deepened outside. His father no longer allowed unnecessary trips into the streets. Meals were quieter now. Candlelight replaced conversation during many evenings while his parents exchanged worried glances above bowls of thin soup and dark bread. Sometimes his mother cried softly after believing he had already fallen asleep beside the fire. The boy did not fully understand death yet, he only understood disappearance. The old woman who sold apples near the square vanished first, then the blacksmith stopped hammering iron below the apartment windows. Then his closest friend no longer appeared in the street outside carrying wooden toys and laughing beneath the church bells. Each absence made the city feel stranger, as though invisible hands were quietly removing pieces of the world one by one. At night, the silence unsettled him most deeply. Medieval cities were never truly quiet before the plague. There had always been footsteps, animals, distant music, or drunken voices drifting upward from taverns below. Now entire stretches of darkness passed without sound except for occasional bells or the creaking wheels of wagons moving through the streets long after midnight. Once, unable to sleep, the boy looked from the window and saw men carrying bodies wrapped in cloth toward a cart waiting beneath torchlight. Afterward, he stopped asking his parents certain questions. Children during the plague years learned quickly which silences adults could not bear to break. Yet even within the fear, small moments of childhood survived stubbornly. The boy still traced shapes glimpse into frost gathering along the glass, he still watched snow falling softly between rooftops and imagined distant worlds beyond the city walls. Sometimes his father carved tiny wooden animals beside the fire to make him smile, if only briefly. And outside, life still continued in fragments. A baker reopened his shop for a few mornings. A priest blessed travelers passing through the square. Somewhere far away, spring waited patiently beyond the winter clouds. But from the apartment window, the boy watched his city growing emptier week by week beneath the shadow of the plague, and though he lacked the words to describe it fully, he understood one thing with painful clarity. The world he remembered was disappearing before his eyes. Inside the monasteries of plague-stricken Europe, candlelight continued burning long after much of the world outside had fallen into fear and silence. The monk sat alone beneath those candles each night, bent carefully over parchment while cold winds moved softly against the stone walls beyond his chamber. Around him rested shelves of handwritten books preserved across generations, scriptures, histories, prayers, medical texts, and fragments of ancient knowledge copied patiently by countless hands before his own. The monastery had always existed as a place of routine and order. Bells marked the hours, prayers rose before dawn. Meals were eaten quietly beside scripture readings and flickering firelight. But during the plague years, even sacred places changed. Many monasteries became shelters for the sick, the frightened, and the dying. Priests and monks traveled constantly between nearby villages carrying food, prayers, and final rites to homes already darkened by fever. Some brothers disappeared into illness themselves after tending to the infected day after day. Entire religious communities weakened beneath exhaustion and grief. Still, the candles continued burning. The monk often worked through the deepest hours of night because sleep had become difficult after witnessing so much suffering beyond the monastery walls. He had buried fellow brothers in frozen earth beside the chapel. He had listened to mothers weeping beside dying children. He had copied the names of the dead into monastery records until entire pages filled almost faster than the ink could dry. And yet he kept writing. For medieval monks, preserving knowledge was not merely labor, it was devotion. Long before printing presses existed, books survived only because human hands patiently copied them word by word beneath candlelight and silence. During the plague, this work gained deeper emotional meaning. The monk understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, how fragile human memory could become when entire communities vanished within only weeks. So he wrote carefully. He recorded the arrival of the sickness in nearby towns. He described funeral bells echoing across empty roads. He copied medical theories beside prayers for mercy and protection. Sometimes his writing became deeply personal, though he rarely intended anyone else to read those lines. He described fear entering the monastery quietly at night. He described the strange stillness hanging over Europe. He described how the world seemed caught between faith and helplessness beneath the endless shadow of death. Outside the monastery, winter snow covered abandoned fields beneath pale moonlight. Travelers arriving after dark brought stories from distant regions where the plague still moved through cities and villages alike. Some roads had become dangerous from hunger and desperation. Certain towns stood nearly empty, yet within the monastery walls, candles continued glowing against the darkness like small acts of resistance against forgetting. At times, the monk wondered why he continued writing while so much of the world collapsed around him. But somewhere deep inside, he understood. Civilizations survive partly through memory. If no one recorded the suffering, the prayers, the fear, and the endurance of these years, then silence would eventually consume them entirely. The written word became a bridge between generations, a way of carrying human experience forward even after countless lives disappeared into history. And so beneath the candles, while bells echoed faintly through the cold European night, the monk kept moving his pen slowly across the parchment. Outside, the plague continued reshaping the world. Inside, one quiet hand continued preserving it. By the later years of the plague, the physicians of Europe carried exhaustion in their eyes long before they entered a patient's home. The man moved slowly through the narrow streets beneath a heavy wool cloak darkened by rain and smoke. In one hand, he carried a leather satchel filled with herbs, cloth bandages, oils, and handwritten remedies copied from ancient medical texts. The tools had once given him confidence. Years earlier, people greeted physicians with hopeful respect, believing knowledge and training could stand firmly against sickness. Now even he no longer fully believed it. At nearly every home he visited, the same signs waited behind the door: fever, trembling, swollen glands dark beneath the skin. Fear hanging thick in the room beside the smell of sweat, sickness, and candle wax burning low through sleepless nights. Families looked toward him with desperate expectation while he examined the ill beneath weak firelight, searching for answers that continued slipping beyond his reach. The physician had spent years studying medicine in monastery libraries and crowded university halls. He learned the teachings of ancient scholars who described illness through balance and harmony within the body. He memorized treatments involving herbs, bloodletting, heat, diet, and prayer. Before the plague, such knowledge often brought comfort if not always certainty. But the Black Death shattered the limits of everything he understood. Patients who seemed stable at sunset sometimes died before dawn. Entire households became sick together without explanation. Remedies failed repeatedly no matter how carefully applied. The physician watched healthy young people collapse beside the elderly and weak alike. Patterns dissolved beneath the sheer unpredictability of suffering, and still people continued calling for him, because even false hope felt better than facing the plague entirely alone. At night, he traveled through nearly silent streets carrying lantern light across wet stone roads while distant bells echoed above the rooftops. Some homes greeted him with quiet relief, others opened their doors slowly, already preparing themselves for another death before morning. He learned to recognize the look in people's eyes, the mixture of terror and pleading that asked questions medicine could no longer answer honestly. Will my child survive? Will the fever pass? Can you stop this? Often he could only lower his gaze gently before offering another mixture of herbs or another whispered prayer. The helplessness settled deeply inside him. To healers, failure repeated endlessly becomes its own kind of wound. The physician began sleeping less each week, haunted by faces he could not save. Meals lost their taste. His hands shook slightly while preparing remedies beside candlelight late at night. Sometimes he sat alone after visiting the sick and stared silently into the fire, wondering whether knowledge itself had limits humanity was never meant to overcome completely. Yet despite everything, he continued working. Not because he believed victory waited ahead, but because suffering demanded witness and care even when cures remained impossible. He still cooled fevers with damp cloths, still comforted frightened families, still listened to final words spoken beside flickering candles while winter winds moved softly beyond the shutters. Outside, Europe continued changing beneath the shadow of the plague. Inside countless homes, physicians like him moved quietly through the darkness carrying medicine that often failed, but also carrying something equally necessary during those terrible years: human presence beside fear. And sometimes, in a dying world, that alone became a form of healing. Before sunrise touched the rooftops of Europe's plague-stricken cities, the grave diggers were already awake. They moved through cold streets wrapped in heavy cloaks against the morning mist, their boots scraping softly across wet stones while the rest of the city remained suspended between sleep and fear. In earlier times, burial had belonged largely to priests, families, and carefully observed rituals carried out with patience and prayer. But during the worst years of the plague, death arrived too quickly for the old customs to survive unchanged, and so new laborers emerged beside catastrophe itself. The grave diggers rarely spoke much while working. Exhaustion had worn silence into them over endless months spent carrying bodies beneath gray skies and funeral bells. Many were ordinary laborers who accepted the work because few others would. Some had already lost families to the sickness and no longer feared proximity to death the way they once had. Others simply needed food and wages inside a collapsing economy where survival itself became uncertain. At dawn, wagons rolled slowly through the city gathering the dead from narrow homes and overcrowded streets. The grave diggers followed beside them carrying ropes, lanterns, and shovels darkened by frozen earth and constant use. Their breath rose pale into the winter air while church bells echoed faintly across rooftops still hidden beneath morning fog. The work never truly ended. Outside the city walls, burial grounds expanded steadily into open fields where trenches stretched across the earth like wounds cut into the landscape itself. Soil turned muddy beneath rain and repeated digging. Priests hurried through shortened prayers because more bodies always waited nearby. Sometimes entire families were buried together beneath thin layers of earth before the next wagon arrived. The grave diggers learned quickly how to separate themselves emotionally from what surrounded them. Otherwise, the sorrow would have crushed them completely. Still, certain moments slipped through the numbness no matter how hard they tried to resist it. A small child wrapped carefully beside a parent, a wedding ring left upon a cold hand. A mother whispering goodbye before stepping away from the burial ground beneath falling snow. These scenes lingered quietly inside the minds of the workers long after the graves themselves disappeared beneath fresh earth. At night, many grave diggers slept poorly. Some dreamed of endless bells ringing across empty cities. Others woke suddenly believing they heard wagon wheels outside once again. The plague had brought them closer to mortality than most human beings ever wished to stand. Day after day, they touched the physical reality of death until the boundary between ordinary life and grief itself began to blur. Yet amid the darkness, small forms of compassion survived stubbornly. One worker might pause to straighten a burial cloth before lowering a body into the trench. Another quietly marked graves with stones so surviving relatives could someday return. Some priests stayed longer than required beside the dead simply because abandoning ritual entirely felt too unbearable for the human spirit. And every morning, before the sun fully rose above Europe's wounded cities, the grave diggers returned once more to their labor beneath cold skies and drifting smoke. History often remembers kings, battles, and great leaders, but during the plague years it was also carried quietly upon the shoulders of exhausted men standing in frozen fields at dawn, burying the dead while civilization struggled desperately to continue breathing around them. When the worst waves of the plague finally began to fade, many survivors discovered that survival itself carried a strange and painful emptiness. The bells still rang across Europe, though less often now. Smoke still drifted above the rooftops of recovering towns. Markets slowly reopened beneath cautious voices and tired faces. Yet everywhere people looked, reminders of absence remained woven into the world around them. A chair left empty beside the fire. A locked shop whose owner never returned, a road leading toward a village where no lights appeared anymore after sunset. For those who survived, life did not suddenly become joyful simply because the sickness weakened. Many awoke each morning carrying exhaustion so deep it seemed to settle into the bones themselves. Grief lingered quietly beneath ordinary routine. People learned how to continue living while surrounded by memories attached to nearly every street, church, and home. The survivors often spoke softly during those years. Loud celebration felt unnatural inside a continent that had buried so many. In villages scattered across France, Italy, and England, families gathered around smaller tables than before. Children grew up listening to stories about relatives they would never meet. Priests recited names of the dead during evening prayers while candlelight flickered against stone walls darkened by smoke and time. Europe had endured the plague, but emotionally it still moved through the long shadow left behind by catastrophe. And yet humanity continued. Farmers returned gradually to abandoned fields where weeds once covered forgotten roads. Blacksmiths reopened workshops beneath the familiar ringing of hammers against iron. Fishermen carried nets toward rivers and harbors glowing softly beneath dawn light. Life rebuilt itself slowly through repetition, necessity, and quiet resilience. The survivors themselves changed deeply. Many no longer trusted permanence the way earlier generations once had. They had witnessed entire households vanish within days. They had watched powerful nobles die beside laborers and priests alike. The plague stripped away illusions of certainty that medieval society had carried for centuries beneath its cathedrals and kingdoms, but it also revealed something enduring beneath the fragility. Human beings continued loving one another despite grief. They continued praying despite uncertainty. They continued planting crops, raising children, copying books, repairing homes, and lighting candles against the darkness even after history had wounded them profoundly. At night, some survivors walked through recovering cities beneath quiet skies and listened to the changed rhythm of the world around them. The streets remained thinner, the bells sounded lonelier, yet somewhere nearby a child still laughed beside a doorway. Somewhere else bread baked inside a warm oven before morning. Tiny signs of ordinary life slowly returned to places once filled entirely with fear. The plague had transformed Europe forever, but it had not erased humanity completely. Inside monasteries, monks still wrote beneath candlelight. In homes touched by sorrow, mothers still sang softly to children before sleep. Travelers still followed roads stretching across forests and mountains beneath the stars. And within the hearts of the survivors themselves, something difficult to name endured quietly beside the grief. Not happiness exactly, not innocence, but the stubborn human ability to continue forward even after the world world has broken apart around them. Across Europe, civilization slowly rose again from silence, carried not by kings or armies alone, but by ordinary survivors learning how to live beside memory while history moved onward into another age. Long after the plague itself faded from Europe's streets, its memory remained alive within the emotional fabric of the continent. Generations passed, children grew into old age, kingdoms changed rulers, wars came and went beneath cathedral towers and shifting borders. Yet across villages, monasteries, and crowded cities alike, people continued speaking quietly about the years when death seemed to move endlessly through the world. The Black Death became more than history, it became inheritance. In many towns, survivors told stories beside fireplaces during winter evenings while younger generations listened silently beneath candlelight. Grandparents described funeral bells ringing through sleepless nights. Priests preserved written accounts of abandoned villages and overflowing graveyards inside monastery libraries. Families remembered the names of relatives lost during the sickness long after the original graves themselves disappeared beneath weather and time. The memory settled deeply because the scale of suffering had altered Europe permanently. Entire communities carried invisible scars passed from one generation to another through fear, ritual, and caution. Even centuries later, unusual illness could still awaken echoes of old panic hidden inside collective memory. Travelers arriving from distant lands sometimes faced suspicion rooted partly in the ancient memory of plague entering Europe through ships and trade routes long ago. The continent learned never to feel entirely safe again. In some cities, annual religious ceremonies emerged honoring those who died during the plague years. Candles were lit beside church altars where prayers for the dead continued across generations. Processions moved through streets once haunted by wagons carrying bodies beneath gray skies. The rituals became ways of carrying grief forward without allowing it to disappear completely into silence. At night, medieval Europe itself often seemed shaped by remembrance. Artists painted skeletal figures beside kings and bishops, reminding viewers that death reached every human life eventually. Writers composed poems about fragile civilizations and fleeting earthly glory. Monasteries preserved chronicles describing empty roads, silent marketplaces, and winters filled with funeral bells echoing through the darkness. Even architecture carried traces of fear left behind by the plague. Certain towns widened streets or reorganized crowded neighborhoods after witnessing how quickly sickness spread through tightly packed communities. Cemeteries expanded beyond old boundaries. Hospitals and charitable institutions slowly gained greater importance within urban life. Europe rebuilt itself physically, but the rebuilding always occurred beside memory. Emotionally, the plague changed how people understood time itself. Before the Black Death, many medieval communities believed the world around them would continue much as it always had beneath the protection of tradition, religion, and social order. The plague shattered that certainty. Survivors learned how suddenly ordinary life could disappear. Prosperity could collapse. Entire families could vanish before the changing of a season. And once humanity learned such lessons deeply enough, they rarely disappear completely, yet memory also became a source of resilience. Europe remembered not only suffering but survival. Monks who continued writing beneath candlelight. Families who rebuilt homes after entire streets fell silent. Farmers who returned to abandoned fields beneath recovering skies. The memory of endurance lived beside the memory of death itself. Across centuries, the plague remained present like a distant shadow stretching quietly behind European civilization. Not always visible but never fully gone. And beneath the evening bells of countless towns and cities, generations continued carrying forward stories from the years when the world seemed to stand at the edge of darkness, and somehow, despite unimaginable loss, continued onward into history once more. Even after the first great wave of the Black Death passed, Europe never fully escaped the fear of plague returning, and return it did. Across the centuries that followed, new outbreaks emerged again and again like dark echoes moving through the continent's memory. Some arrived quietly within crowded ports where merchant ships unloaded grain and silk beneath restless gulls. Others spread through inland towns after harsh winters, famine, or war weakened already fragile populations. The sickness no longer destroyed Europe on the same unimaginable scale as the 14th century, yet every new outbreak awakened old terror sleeping beneath generations of memory. The bells would begin again, a few unexplained fevers inside a crowded district, then whispers in marketplaces, then shuttered homes and priests moving through the streets carrying candles beneath gray skies. For survivors descended from plague-ridden generations, the signs felt painfully familiar. In London, Paris, Venice, Vienna, and countless smaller towns, later outbreaks repeatedly reminded Europe how vulnerable civilization remained before unseen disease. Some epidemics lasted only months before fading. Others returned season after season, leaving behind fresh graveyards and frightened cities struggling once more against uncertainty. The fear itself became part of ordinary life. Parents warned children about sickness arriving from distant ships. Travelers carried letters proving the health of the towns they departed from. Quarantines slowly emerged as authorities attempted to isolate infected regions before disease spread farther inland. The very word quarantine came from the Italian practice of forcing ships to wait 40 days before entering port during times of plague. Humanity was learning slowly through repetition and suffering. At night, the atmosphere surrounding these later outbreaks still carried the same emotional weight remembered from earlier centuries. Candlelight flickered behind locked windows while guards watched city gates beneath torchlight and cold rain. Doctors walked narrow streets wearing dark robes and heavy masks filled with herbs. Funeral bells returned to the air, softer perhaps than before, but still capable of awakening ancient dread buried deep within the European imagination. Many people believed the plague would never truly leave the world. And for centuries, they were almost correct. Entire generations grew up knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon another outbreak might already be moving slowly toward them along roads, rivers, or trade routes. Merchants feared crowded ports during times of sickness. Noble courts fled cities whenever rumors appeared. Ordinary villagers watched strangers carefully whenever disease spread in nearby regions. The memory of catastrophe had become instinct, yet Europe also adapted. Cities improved systems for isolating the sick. Officials tracked outbreaks more carefully than earlier generations had been able to do. Physicians slowly recorded observations about contagion, sanitation, and patterns of transmission even before fully understanding the science behind them. Fear remained powerful, but human knowledge was beginning its slow movement toward understanding. Still, the emotional shadow never disappeared entirely. Even centuries after the first Black Death, old stories survived beside fireplaces and monastery walls. Grandparents described empty streets from earlier outbreak. Priests preserved records of plague years within church archive. Artists continued painting death beside kings and peasants alike as reminders of mortality's reach across every human life. And across Europe, beneath changing kingdoms and passing centuries, humanity carried forward a quiet awareness born from repeated suffering. That invisible things moving silently through the world could alter history more completely than armies, crowns, or empires ever could. The plague returned many times, but so did humanity. Again and again, beneath bells, candlelight, and fearful skies, Europe endured the long shadow of disease while continuing its uncertain journey through history. For centuries after the Black Death first swept across Europe, humanity still did not fully understand what disease truly was. People observed patterns, they recorded symptoms. They noticed that crowded places often suffered more deeply than isolated villages. Yet the invisible world beneath illness remained hidden beyond the reach of medieval science. Physicians continued balancing ancient theories about humors, poisoned air, planetary alignments, and divine judgment while epidemics returned again and again across the continent. Understanding arrived slowly, so slowly that entire generations lived and died between each small step forward. Inside monastery libraries and early universities, scholars preserved medical texts copied carefully beneath candlelight through long winters and uncertain years. Physicians compared observations from different outbreaks, searching for clues hidden within repeated suffering. Some began noticing that disease appeared to spread through proximity and contact more than through mysterious curses alone. Others questioned older assumptions about bloodletting and traditional remedies that failed repeatedly during epidemic. The process felt less like sudden discovery and more like humanity waking gradually from a long night. In port cities especially, practical experience forced change. Venice, Genoa, and other trade centers learned that isolating arriving ships sometimes reduced outbreaks within crowded populations. Quarantine stations emerged beside harbors where travelers and cargo remained separated from cities for weeks before entry. These measures did not eliminate plague entirely, but they represented an important shift. Europe was beginning to treat disease as something observable rather than purely mystical. At night, physicians still moved through fog-filled streets carrying lanterns beside darkened homes. Yet slowly, medical thinking itself changed beneath the surface of European society. Hospitals became more organized, record-keeping improved, scholars exchanged ideas across kingdoms through handwritten letters and preserved manuscripts. Knowledge accumulated patiently, even while fear remained stronger than certainty for many centuries. The progress came at enormous human cost. Every epidemic taught lessons written first in suffering before they reached books or universities. Cities learned the dangers of overcrowding after watching sickness spread through narrow streets. Doctors recognized patterns because countless patients died before them beneath candlelight and prayer. Scientific understanding did not emerge separately from grief. It emerged through grief, and still, humanity continued searching for answers. By the Renaissance and later centuries, curiosity about the natural world expanded more rapidly across Europe. Anatomists studied the human body with increasing precision. Early scientists questioned ancient assumptions that had governed medicine since classical time. Microscopes eventually revealed hidden worlds too small for earlier generations even to imagine. At last, humanity began understanding that invisible organisms could move through water, air, blood, and touch itself. The realization transformed civilization. The plague had once seemed like punishment descending mysteriously from heaven or darkness rising inexplicably from the earth. Now disease slowly became something biological, measurable, and potentially preventable. Sanitation improved, public health systems developed gradually. Cities redesigned water supplies and waste systems after centuries of devastating outbreaks taught painful lessons about contamination and human vulnerability. Yet even as knowledge advanced, memory remained. Doctors still carried emotional echoes from generations before them, from plague physicians walking torchlit streets without answers, from monks recording mass burials beneath candlelight, from families waiting beside sickbeds through endless nights of fear. The slow birth of medical understanding was not merely a scientific journey. It was humanity's long effort to bring light into mysteries that had once darkened entire civilizations. And beneath the changing centuries of Europe, the lessons born from plague continued guiding that search for understanding forward, one fragile discovery at a time. After centuries of plague, Europe's cities no longer looked at themselves the same way. The old medieval world had been built quickly and closely. Houses leaned over narrow streets where sunlight rarely reached the ground. Waste flowed through crowded alleys beside marketplaces filled with animals, smoke, and thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder within stone walls meant originally for protection rather than health. Before the plague, most cities accepted such conditions as ordinary parts of urban life. But repeated epidemics changed the way people understood crowded spaces. Fear itself began reshaping architecture. Across Europe, rulers and city officials slowly realized that the design of streets, water systems, and public spaces might influence survival during times of sickness. The transformation did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually through generations who remembered funeral bells, quarantines, and homes sealed shut beneath the shadow of disease. And so the cities began rebuilding themselves from fear as much as from hope. In some regions, streets widened to allow more movement and cleaner air between buildings. Open public squares expanded where crowded markets once pressed tightly together beneath dark walls. Drainage systems improved slowly after centuries of witnessing how filth and standing water deepened suffering during outbreak. Wells received greater protection. Certain burial grounds moved farther from populated districts as understanding about sanitation slowly developed. At first, these changes remained uneven and incomplete. Europe still struggled with poverty, overcrowding, and periodic outbreaks of disease for many generations afterward. Yet beneath the surface, a different philosophy of city life had begun emerging. Survival no longer depended only upon walls, armies, or religion. Increasingly, it also depended upon how human beings organized the spaces where they lived together. The plague had taught civilization that invisible dangers could move through ordinary daily life itself. In Venice and other major port cities, quarantine stations appeared near harbors where arriving ships waited before passengers entered crowded streets. Guards inspected travelers more carefully during outbreak. Warehouses storing imported goods faced new rules meant to reduce contamination. Commerce still flowed across Europe, but now it moved beside systems shaped directly by centuries of fear and memory. At night, the recovering cities carried a different atmosphere than before the Black Death. Lanterns reflected across cleaner streets in certain districts. New hospitals rose beside church towers where monasteries once handled much of the care for the sick alone. Public officials monitored outbreaks with growing seriousness whenever rumors of plague returned along trade routes. Humanity remained vulnerable, but it was learning slowly how to defend itself more carefully against unseen threats. And emotionally, the transformation reached even deeper. People began viewing cities not merely as places of trade and power, but as living systems requiring protection and balance. The plague altered humanity's relationship with shared space itself. Every crowded alley, contaminated well, and overflowing cemetery became reminders that civilization depended upon invisible forms of order many earlier generations had barely considered. Still, beneath the rebuilding, memory lingered quietly. Elderly survivors told stories about streets once filled with wagons carrying the dead. Priests remembered winters when bells rang endlessly through the fog. Entire neighborhoods carried scars hidden beneath newer walls and cleaner roads. The cities rose again, but they rose carrying lessons carved painfully into history through centuries of sickness and survival. And beneath the evening skies of Europe, civilization slowly rebuilt itself into something more cautious, more organized, and perhaps slightly more aware of how fragile human life can become when fear enters the streets beside disease. After the plague, death no longer belonged only to graveyards and funeral prayers. It entered the imagination of Europe itself. Across cathedrals, manuscripts, poems, songs, and whispered stories beside winter fires, medieval people began surrounding themselves with reminders of mortality in ways earlier generations had rarely done so openly. The Black Death had forced humanity to look directly at suffering on a scale too immense to ignore. Millions had vanished. Entire villages disappeared from memory. Survivors carried images of mass burials, silent streets, and endless funeral bells deep within their minds long after the sickness faded. And so death became woven into the emotional language of the age. Artists painted skeletons leading kings, bishops, merchants, and peasants together in silent processions known as the Dance of Death. These murals appeared across churches and cemeteries throughout Europe, reminding viewers that no wealth, title, or power could protect humanity forever from the grave. The images felt haunting, yet strangely peaceful too. Death was no longer portrayed merely as terror, but as an inevitable companion walking quietly beside every human life. People understood these images intimately because they had lived through them. In monasteries, candlelight flickered across manuscripts filled with prayers about impermanence and fragile earthly glory. Poets wrote about crumbling kingdoms and the temporary nature of beauty itself. Bells, skulls, fading candles, and hourglasses appeared repeatedly in medieval symbolism after the plague years, reflecting a civilization newly aware of how quickly ordinary life could vanish. Even religious imagination changed beneath the long shadow of disease. Sermons spoke more often about judgment, mortality, and the uncertainty of human existence. Worshippers entering churches passed paintings where saints stood beside images of decay and death. Graveyards became places not hidden from daily life, but integrated directly beside homes, marketplaces, and cathedral walls as constant reminders of life's brevity. At night, these themes felt especially powerful. A lone candle burning beside a monastery window could symbolize both faith and fragility. Wind moving through cemetery crosses carried emotional weight for people who remembered how many graves had filled during the plague years. The medieval imagination became quieter, more reflective, and often more emotionally intimate with suffering itself. Yet there was beauty hidden within this darkness too. The plague did not make Europe abandon meaning or hope. Instead, it deepened humanity's desire to preserve memory, faith, and emotional connection despite mortality. Art after the Black Death often carried unusual tenderness beside its sorrow. Paintings lingered carefully upon human faces. Writers reflected more deeply upon love, loss, time, and the fleeting nature of earthly existence. Civilization had looked directly into catastrophe, and afterward it dreamed differently. Across Europe, ordinary people carried small reminders of mortality into everyday life. Some kept prayer books decorated with skulls or fading flowers. Others wore religious symbols emphasizing humility before death. Even festivals and public rituals sometimes blended celebration with quiet acknowledgement that human life moved quickly beneath the passage of time. The plague transformed not only bodies and cities, but imagination itself. And for centuries afterward, beneath cathedral bells and candlelit chapels, Europe continued creating art heart shaped by the memory of those terrible years when death walked openly beside humanity and left its shadow across the dreams of an entire civilization. Centuries passed after the Black Death, yet the echoes of the plague never fully disappeared from the modern world. The medieval cities where funeral bells once rang endlessly have changed beyond recognition now. Electric lights glow where candles once trembled behind monastery windows. Crowded roads stretch across continents once connected only by muddy trade routes and fragile wooden ships. Science has uncovered invisible worlds of bacteria, viruses, and infection that medieval physicians could scarcely have imagined. And still humanity remains vulnerable in familiar ways. The plague left behind more than historical memory. It reshaped how civilizations think about disease, public health, cities, fear, and human connection itself. Many systems that now feel ordinary, quarantine procedures, sanitation laws, organized hospitals, public health monitoring, emerged slowly from lessons first learned during centuries of epidemic suffering across Europe. Modern medicine grew partly from humanity's refusal to forget those years. When later generations studied outbreaks of illness, they carried forward knowledge preserved by monks, physicians, city officials, and survivors who recorded what they witnessed beneath candlelight long ago. The fear surrounding contagious disease continued influencing governments, architecture, trade, and scientific research across centuries of human history. And emotionally, the parallels never vanished completely either. Whenever modern societies face epidemic fear, certain ancient patterns quietly return. Streets grow quieter, travelers become objects of suspicion. Families wait anxiously beside sick loved ones. Ordinary routines suddenly feel fragile beneath invisible danger moving silently through the world. Though technology and science have transformed civilization, the emotional experience of uncertainty often remains deeply human in the same ways it did during the plague years. At night, modern cities can still feel strangely similar to the medieval world during times of crisis. Hospitals glowing beneath darkness, empty streets carrying unusual silence, people watching windows, waiting for news, listening for reassurance. History echoes softly across centuries. Yet the modern world also carries something medieval Europe lacked during the Black Death: understanding. Humanity now knows how disease spreads through bodies and populations. Doctors understand bacteria, infection, sanitation, and immunity. Scientists study microscopic worlds invisible to earlier civilizations. Vaccines, antibiotics, and global communication networks allow modern societies to respond with knowledge unimaginable to plague-stricken Europe. But knowledge has not erased fragility completely. The Black Death remains powerful in human memory partly because it revealed truths extending beyond one disease or one century. Civilizations are delicate. Human beings depend profoundly upon one another. Invisible forces can reshape history more quickly than armies or kings, and survival often depends not only upon science, but upon compassion, endurance, and the quiet willingness to continue caring for one another during fearful times. Across Europe today, tourists walk through ancient streets where plague wagons once rolled beneath torchlight. Cathedral bells still echo above cities transformed by centuries of rebuilding. Monasteries still preserve manuscripts written by candlelight during the darkest years of the Black Death. The physical world moved forward, yet traces of those years remain woven into architecture, culture, memory, and collective imagination. And perhaps that is the final echo the plague carried into the modern world: not merely fear of disease, but deeper awareness of shared humanity itself. Because beneath every century, every kingdom, every invention and generation, human beings still search for the same comforts they searched for during the long nights of the plague: light against darkness, companionship against fear, and hope strong enough to endure even when history itself feels uncertain. When the plague finally began to fade from Europe, the silence it left behind felt almost unreal. For years, the continent had lived beneath the constant rhythm of funeral bells, whispered prayers, creaking wagons, and fearful voices echoing through crowded streets. Death had become woven into the ordinary sound of existence itself. Entire generations learned to sleep beside the distant tolling of church towers announcing another passing soul before dawn. Then slowly, almost cautiously, the bells began ringing less often. At first few people trusted the quiet. Survivors woke during the night expecting once again to hear wheels moving through the streets below their windows or priests knocking softly upon doors before sunrise. In many towns, people still moved carefully through marketplaces as though the plague might suddenly return with the next arriving traveler or merchant ship drifting through morning fog. Fear had settled so deeply into the human mind that even peace itself itself felt uncertain, and yet the silence continued growing. Across Europe, roads once crowded with burial processions slowly reopened to ordinary life again. Bakers lit ovens before dawn without hearing funeral bells interrupt the morning air every hour. Children returned cautiously to village paths where laughter had long disappeared beneath grief. Farmers guided plows across fields abandoned during the worst years of sickness while spring rain softened the earth beneath their feet. The world had survived, but it no longer sounded the same. In the great cities of Europe, survivors walked through streets carrying invisible ghosts beside them. Every neighborhood contained memories attached to empty windows and vanished voices. A woman passing a marketplace might remember the friend who once sold apples there before fever arrived one winter morning. A priest entering a church at dusk might still picture rows of candles burning during endless nights of prayer for the dying. The silence after catastrophe is never truly empty. It is filled with memory. At night, recovering towns often seemed suspended between sorrow and relief. Candlelight glowed warmly once more behind wooden shutters while smoke drifted peacefully upward from hearth fires into cold evening skies. Yet beneath the comforting return of ordinary routines lingered emotional exhaustion too deep for words. Europe had endured years during which death touched nearly every family, every village, every monastery, and every road. No one emerged unchanged. Some survivors found themselves unable to fully trust happiness again. Joy felt fragile now, temporary in ways earlier generations had never imagined so clearly. Others clung more tightly to ordinary moments precisely because they understood how quickly such moments could disappear. A shared meal beside candlelight, the sound of rain against a rooftop, the presence of loved ones gathered safely within one room. Small comforts became sacred after the plague years. And across the countryside, silence settled heavily over places that would never recover completely. Entire villages remained abandoned beneath drifting grass and collapsing roofs. Forgotten roads vanished slowly into forests reclaiming land once cultivated carefully across generations. Churchyards expanded beyond old stone walls while weather faded the names carved into countless grave markers left behind by the dead. Nature itself moved patiently through the emptiness. Birdsong returned to fields where funeral processions once crossed frozen earth. Rivers flowed quietly beside ruined mills and silent farmhouses. Seasons continued changing beneath the sky exactly as they always had, indifferent to human sorrow yet strangely comforting because of that constancy. The plague had reminded Europe how temporary civilization could become, yet the world continued turning. Monks still copied books beneath candlelight inside stone monasteries. Merchants once again crossed the sea carrying silk, salt, and stories between distant ports. Children born after the worst years of sickness chased one another through recovering streets without fully understanding why older generations sometimes fell silent while watching them play. Life rebuilt itself slowly through repetition. One repaired roof, one replanted field, one candle lit against the darkness after another. And perhaps that quiet rebuilding became the most remarkable part of all. Human beings, despite grief vast enough to reshape continents, continued moving forward through history with fragile but stubborn persistence. They mourned the dead while still planting gardens beside their homes. They buried loved ones while continuing to sing hymns beneath cathedral ceilings. They carried memory without allowing memory alone to become the entire future. In the silence after the plague, Europe discovered something difficult and deeply human. Civilizations can break, worlds can change forever. Yet beneath the weight of sorrow, ordinary people still wake each morning, light candles against the darkness, and begin again. And across the quiet continent, beneath evening skies no longer filled with endless funeral bells, humanity slowly learned how to live beside memory while moving gently forward into another age. Civilizations often believe themselves permanent while they are still standing. The people of medieval Europe once looked upon their cathedrals, kingdoms, marketplaces, and ancient traditions with the quiet confidence of those who assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Stone walls surrounded prosperous cities. Church bells organized the rhythm of ordinary life. Trade routes carried wealth across continents beneath the protection of kings, nobles, and faith that seemed eternal. Then the plague arrived, and within only a handful of of years, millions disappeared from the world. The Black Death revealed something humanity has struggled to accept across every century since. Even the strongest human worlds remain fragile beneath the larger forces moving silently through history. A civilization may appear solid as stone while already standing at the edge of transformation no one fully sees approaching. At night, survivors of the plague often sat beside candlelight reflecting upon this mystery without possessing words large enough to explain it completely. How could crowded cities fall silent so quickly? How could entire villages vanish beneath sickness and fear? How could generations of stability disappear almost between one winter and the next? The questions lingered long after the disease itself faded, and perhaps they still linger now. Across Europe, the plague changed not only bodies and governments but humanity's emotional understanding of permanence itself. Before the catastrophe, many people viewed the world around them as part of a stable divine order stretching endlessly backward and forward through time. The Black Death shattered that illusion. It taught ordinary people that history could shift suddenly beneath human feet like earth breaking beneath ice. One season may feel ordinary, the next may divide the world into before and after forever. Yet strangely, within that fragility lies part of what makes human civilization beautiful at all. Because human beings continue building despite uncertainty. They raise cathedrals even knowing time will weather the stone. They create families despite mortality. They preserve stories, paint murals, compose songs, and light candles against darkness, although every generation eventually fades into memory itself. The plague revealed how temporary human worlds can become, but it also revealed how deeply humanity desires meaning despite that impermanence. In the quiet years after the Black Death, Europe slowly relearned how to live inside uncertainty. Farmers planted crops without guarantees about the future. Merchants reopened trade routes despite remembering ships that once carried death beside silk and spice. Children grew into adulthood beneath the stories of grief carried by parents and grandparents who survived the plague years. The continent moved forward while carrying emotional knowledge earlier generations had never possessed so clearly. Nothing lasts forever, and yet life continues anyway. At night, beneath recovering skies, monks still copied books beside candlelight because preserving knowledge mattered even inside fragile civilization. Mothers still sang softly to children before sleep because love remained meaningful despite mortality. Builders repaired churches and bridges knowing future centuries would eventually reshape them again. Human beings kept creating temporary worlds because temporary worlds were all humanity had ever truly possessed. The plague merely forced Europe to see that truth more clearly. Even now, centuries later, modern civilization carries many of the same illusions medieval Europe once held before the bells began ringing. Cities feel permanent, systems feel stable. Daily routines create the comforting sense that tomorrow will unfold predictably beneath familiar skies. Yet history repeatedly reminds humanity how quickly invisible forces, disease, war, disaster, fear, change itself, can alter entire societies in ways no generation fully expects beforehand. The fragility remains, not as punishment, not as cruelty, simply as part of existing within time. And perhaps recognizing that fragility can deepen appreciation for the ordinary moments human beings so often overlook while life feels secure. A warm room during winter rain, conversations shared beside candlelight, the sound of distant bells across sleeping rooftops, the comfort of loved ones gathered safely together beneath one roof. These moments matter precisely because they cannot last forever. Across medieval Europe, survivors of the plague eventually understood something profound beneath their grief. Civilization is not truly stone walls, kingdoms, or wealth alone. It is human connection carried carefully through uncertainty from one generation to another. It is memory preserved despite loss. It is compassion surviving beside fear. And even after entire worlds seem to collapse, humanity continues rebuilding fragile beauty once more beneath the passing centuries. Because perhaps the most enduring part of civilization has never been permanence at all. Perhaps it has always been the quiet courage to continue creating meaning inside a temporary world. The candles still burned after the plague, not brightly at first. In the years following the Black Death, Europe often felt quieter than any generation could remember. Entire regions carried the emotional weight of absence. Roads stretched past abandoned homes where no voices answered the wind anymore. Cathedral bells echoed above smaller congregations gathered beneath stone ceilings darkened by centuries of smoke and prayer. Survivors moved carefully through ordinary life as though afraid the silence itself might break if touched too suddenly. And yet, Even within that silence, small lights continued appearing against the darkness. A monk leaning over parchment beside a flickering candle, still copying books so memory would survive another century. A baker waking before dawn to warm an oven inside a recovering village. A mother singing softly to her child while winter rain touched the shutters outside. These moments seemed small compared to the enormity of history surrounding them. Yet civilization has always survived through such smallness. Great kingdoms rise and fall beneath time, but human endurance often reveals itself most clearly in ordinary acts repeated quietly across generations. The plague had taken millions. It had altered economies, reshaped cities, transformed religion, weakened old systems of power, and filled Europe's imagination with lasting awareness of mortality. But it had not extinguished humanity's instinct to continue. That instinct became the candle still burning after the bells fell silent. Across the continent, life rebuilt itself slowly through gestures so simple they might almost seem invisible to history itself. Farmers replanted fields abandoned during the worst years of death. Craftsmen reopened workshops where dust had gathered for seasons untouched. Children born after the plague learned laughter from parents who still carried grief in their eyes while watching them play beneath evening skies. The world remained wounded, yet it also remained alive. At night, recovering cities once again glowed softly beneath windows filled with candlelight and conversation. Merchants crossed dark seas carrying trade between distant ports. Pilgrims followed roads winding through forests and mountains beneath familiar stars. Europe moved forward not because suffering had been forgotten, but because humanity possesses a strange and enduring ability to continue living beside sorrow without allowing sorrow alone to define existence forever. Perhaps that is why the story of the Black Death still feels deeply human centuries later. Not only because of the scale of death, but because of what survived beside it. Compassion survived, curiosity survived, art survived, memory survived, even tenderness survived. During the darkest plague years, people still cared for the sick despite fear. Priests still whispered prayers beside dying strangers. Grave diggers still paused gently over the dead before returning to their endless labor. Monks still preserved books beneath candlelight because they believed future generations deserved to inherit knowledge even from a wounded world, and future generations did arrive. The children who grew up after the plague carried Europe into new centuries of change, discovery, conflict, and creation. Kingdoms transformed, scientific understanding expanded. Great cathedrals continued rising toward the sky. The Renaissance slowly emerged from a continent that had once believed itself trapped beneath endless darkness. History moved onward. Yet somewhere beneath every later century remained the memory of those candlelit years when humanity stood close to collapse and endured anyway. Even now, if one walks through the old cities of Europe during quiet evening hours, traces of that memory still linger gently within the stone streets and cathedral walls. Bells still echo above rooftops where plague survivors once listened fearfully through sleepless night. Candlelight still flickers inside ancient churches built by generations who understood how fragile life could become beneath time and uncertainty. And perhaps that is the final comfort carried by history. Human worlds may be temporary, civilizations may rise and fall. Fear and suffering may return across different ages wearing different faces. Yet human beings continue lighting candles against the darkness generation after generation, century after century, even while knowing the night will always exist around them. Because hope is rarely loud inside history, more often it is quiet. A small flame trembling softly within the dark, still burning, still warm, still guiding humanity forward through the long passage of time.